Pearl Holmes didn't hear the first gasp she felt it. It started like a normal corporate charity gala inside the glass-lit ballroom of the Reed Foundation. Champagne, cameras, polished smiles. Then Cameron Reed stepped up to the podium, adjusting his cufflinks like nothing in his life was about to collapse. His eyes briefly met hers and stayed empty. Tonight, he said smoothly, I want to talk about change. About difficult decisions and new beginnings. A few guests shifted. Someone whispered behind Pearl's back. Then came the sentence that froze her blood. Pearl and I have decided to separate. Applause. Not for her, but for him. And in that exact second, her phone lit up. Harper Lawson, filing confirmed. Submitted Monday. Pearl didn't move. She didn't blink. Because Cameron Reed had no idea. He had just announced a divorce that had already been legally won against him. Have you ever watched someone try to rewrite a story you already finished? Tell me in the comments. Would you stay silent like Pearl, or speak up in that exact moment? And if you want to see how she turns this silence into revenge, make sure to subscribe. For a moment, Pearl Holmes didn't react at all. Not because she was calm, because her mind was refusing to accept that reality could be this cruel, this public, this carefully staged. The applause in the ballroom kept going soft at first, then building like a polite wave of approval for a man who had just detonated a marriage in front of 200 people. Cameras shifted instinctively toward Cameron Reed, catching his composed expression, the slight tightening at the corner of his jaw that made him look controlled, even noble. They were framing him as the man who had the courage to move on. No one was looking at Pearl, and that was the first mistake, because Pearl was not falling apart. She was listening to the sound of her own heartbeat slow down, not speed up. Listening to the way betrayal doesn't arrive like lightning, it arrives like a decision someone made a long time ago and only just revealed. Cameron stepped down from the podium as if nothing important had happened. A few board members clapped him on the shoulder. Someone laughed softly, as if this was simply corporate evolution dressed up as emotional maturity. Then he looked at her. Not with guilt, not with regret, with caution. Like she was a variable he hadn't fully calculated. He walked toward her through the crowd. Pearl didn't move. Her champagne glass stayed in her hand, untouched. The condensation had started forming rings on her fingers, cold and steady, like time itself had stopped caring about her. Pearl, Cameron said quietly when he reached her. His voice changed when no one else was listening. Lower, colder, more efficient. I didn't want it to happen like this. That sentence. Not I didn't want to hurt you. Not I'm sorry. Just inconvenience framed as regret. Pearl studied his face like she was seeing it for the first time. Not the man she married. Not the man who used to leave small notes on her coffee machine. Not the man who once held her hand in hospital waiting rooms. This version. The one who rehearsed her humiliation in advance. You just announced our marriage like a quarterly report, she said softly. A flicker passed through his eyes. Irritation, maybe. Or discomfort that she wasn't performing the role he expected, crying, shaking, collapsing. Behind him, someone passed by and whispered, "Poor thing," without even looking at her properly. Poor thing, as if she was an object left behind in a fire. Cameron lowered his voice further. We talked about this privately. No, Pearl replied. One word. Clean. Final. We talked about your version of it. That landed differently. For the first time, Cameron's expression tightened. Not guilt. Not remorse. Control slipping. He leaned slightly closer. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. That sentence again. As if she was the obstacle in a decision he had already finalized. Pearl almost smiled. Because he still didn't understand. He thought this moment was the ending. He didn't realize it was the middle of something he had already lost. Her phone vibrated inside her clutch. Once, twice. She didn't open it immediately. She didn't need to. She already knew what it was. Harper Lawson didn't send unnecessary messages. She excused herself from Cameron's presence without waiting for permission, something she had never done in 10 years of marriage. She turned slightly just enough to break eye contact and walked toward the quiet edge of the ballroom where the glass walls reflected the city lights like a second universe watching everything unfold. Only then did she open the message. Harper Lawson, filing confirmed. Submitted Monday 9:14 a.m. Court acknowledgement received. You're first. He's secondary. A slow inhale entered Pearl's lungs. Not relief. Precision. Because this wasn't about heartbreak anymore. It was about timing. And Cameron Reed had just made a very expensive mistake in front of very powerful people. Behind her, she could still hear him speaking to someone, explaining, justifying, reframing. He understands, he was probably saying. No, he didn't understand anything. Pearl turned back. From across the room, she saw him now differently. Not as her husband, but as a man standing in a narrative he no longer controlled. A board member approached him, shaking his hand. Another patted his back. Someone raised a glass. They were celebrating his bravery. Cameron smiled again. The performance resumed. And that was when Pearl realized something almost terrifyingly calm inside herself. He wasn't just leaving her. He was trying to erase her properly. Make her the one who disappears quietly so his life continues uninterrupted. But he had miscalculated one critical thing. Pearl Holmes was not the kind of woman who disappears. She took a slow sip of her champagne for the first time. It tasted bitter. Not because of the drink, because of memory, because of everything she had tolerated that suddenly made perfect sense in hindsight. Late nights that never had explanations. Phones turned face down too quickly. Conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. And the worst part? How she had normalized all of it. A voice behind her interrupted the silence. Mrs. Reed, a journalist. Young, eager, holding a microphone like it could save her career. We weren't aware of the announcement tonight. Could you comment on... Pearl looked at her. For a second the journalist hesitated. Something about Pearl's expression must have felt wrong. Not broken. Not emotional. Controlled. Dangerously controlled. Pearl gave a small, polite smile. The kind women learn when they are expected to suffer gracefully. I think my husband has already said everything he needed to say, she replied. Then she turned away before any follow-up question could land. Because she felt it again. Her phone. Another message. This time, not from Harper. Unknown number. Just one line. You think you're ahead. You're not. Pearl stared at it. No reaction on her face, but something inside her shifted. Not fear, recognition. Because Cameron didn't send that message. He didn't even know she had filed, which meant someone else was watching this unfold too closely. And for the first time that night, Pearl Holmes understood something far more dangerous than betrayal. This wasn't just a divorce. It was a war that had already started before she even knew she was a participant. Across the room, Cameron was laughing now softly, confidently, like a man who believed the hardest part was already over. He had no idea. The hardest part had already been decided on Monday morning, and he was standing in it, thinking it was Tuesday's victory. Pearl lowered her phone slowly. Her reflection in the glass wall looked back at her, composed, still unreadable. And beneath that stillness, something irreversible had begun to wake up. Not sadness, not grief, but clarity. Cold, sharp, and patient. Because if Cameron Reed wanted a clean ending, Pearl Holmes was about to teach him what a beginning actually looked like. Pearl Holmes didn't cry on the drive home. That surprised even her. Rain slid across the windshield of her black Mercedes in soft silver lines, while downtown Chicago blurred into streaks of light and shadow. The city looked cinematic at night, beautiful enough to fool people into believing ugly things never happened inside it. Her wedding ring sat in the cup holder beside her. She had taken it off at a red light without thinking. 10 years of marriage reduced to a pale indentation on her finger. Pearl tightened her grip on the steering wheel as Cameron's words replayed in her head again. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. The arrogance of it made her stomach turn now, not because he wanted a divorce, because he believed he controlled the narrative. Her phone buzzed through the car speakers. Harper Lawson. Pearl answered immediately. "You left early," Harper said. "I think public humiliation has a reasonable time limit." "That bad?" Pearl laughed once. Short, hollow. He announced it during a charity speech. There was silence on the other end. Then Harper exhaled slowly. "That was deliberate." "Yes." And Pearl glanced at the ring again. "And I think he expected me to break publicly. Did you know?" Another silence. This one different. Harper had been Pearl's attorney for only 3 weeks, but she already understood something most people missed. Pearl's calmness was not weakness. It was containment. "Good," Harper finally said. "Because emotionally reactive women lose leverage in courtrooms." Pearl leaned her head back briefly against the seat. "You know what the worst part is? What I spent years trying to become easier to love." The confession slipped out before she could stop it. The words lingered heavily inside the quiet car. Harper's tone softened slightly. "Women like you always think endurance will eventually become appreciation." Pearl swallowed hard. Outside the window, the city kept moving like nothing had happened. But everything had happened. Every ignored dinner. Every lonely anniversary. Every night, Cameron came home smelling like expensive whiskey and another life. She used to tell herself it was stress, corporate pressure, executive burnout. Now she wondered how many lies women renamed just to survive them. "You filed at exactly the right time," Harper continued. Monday morning secured jurisdiction before he acted. Pearl closed her eyes briefly. That filing. She remembered sitting in Harper's office 24 hours earlier, hands trembling slightly as she signed the papers. Not because she still doubted Cameron loved her. That illusion had already died. No. She trembled because signing the papers meant finally admitting she had spent years emotionally starving inside her own marriage. "You're sure his filing changes nothing?" Pearl asked. "It changes his ego," Harper replied. "Legally nothing." That almost made Pearl smile. Almost. She parked outside the penthouse building she and Cameron shared overlooking Lake Michigan. The doorman greeted her carefully, tonight too carefully. He already knew. Of course he did. People always knew before the woman at the center of the disaster did. "I can have your car brought down in the morning, Mrs. Reed," he offered gently. Pearl paused. Mrs. Reed. For the first time, the name felt borrowed. "Thank you," she said quietly, before walking toward the elevators. The ride upstairs felt endless. Mirrored walls reflected a woman she barely recognized, elegant black dress, diamond earrings, perfect makeup, and eyes that suddenly looked much older than 40. The penthouse doors opened into darkness. Cameron wasn't home yet. That should have hurt. Instead, it clarified things. Pearl kicked off her heels slowly and walked across the marble floors toward the kitchen. The silence inside the apartment was massive, expensive, empty. Their home had always looked like a magazine spread. Minimalist furniture, designer lighting, perfect wine collection. No warmth anywhere. She opened the refrigerator, automatically staring blankly at untouched groceries. Cameron used to complain she bought too much food for someone who barely cooked anymore. But Pearl remembered why she stopped cooking. Because eating alone eventually feels humiliating. Her phone lit up again. This time from an unknown number. "He's lying to both of you." Pearl froze. The message disappeared almost instantly after opening. No name. No explanation. A chill moved through her spine. "Both of you." Natalie Brooks. The name from the financial records Harper had quietly uncovered 2 days earlier. Pearl moved toward Cameron's office without fully deciding to. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood and cologne. Clean. Controlled. Masculine in the way expensive hotel suites try to feel masculine. She opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Locked, of course. But Cameron had always underestimated one thing about Pearl. She noticed patterns. His birthday. The drawer clicked open immediately. Inside were files arranged with surgical neatness. Tax reports, investment portfolios, corporate documents, and beneath them, a thin black folder. Pearl slowly pulled it out. Hotel receipts, private flight confirmations, luxury purchases, some under Cameron's name, some under Natalie Brooks. Pearl's chest tightened painfully, not because the affair shocked her anymore, because of how organized it was. Planned, maintained, sustained over time. This wasn't reckless cheating. This was a second relationship carefully integrated into his life while she played supportive wife in the background. Her hands shook slightly as she flipped another page, then another. Then she saw the date, December 14th, their anniversary. Pearl stopped breathing for a second. That was the night Cameron claimed he had emergency meetings in New York. The same night Pearl ate dinner alone in their penthouse, while pretending not to feel pathetic for waiting. But there had been no meetings. Only Natalie. A memory hit her violently. Cameron arriving home 2 days later with flowers, kissing her forehead distractedly, saying, "I'm doing all this for us." Pearl laughed suddenly, not softly, not emotionally, a sharp broken sound that echoed through the office like glass cracking. For us, the cruelty of certain lies only becomes visible years later. She sat down slowly in Cameron's leather office chair. The city lights stretched endlessly beyond the windows, while pieces of her marriage rearranged themselves into something uglier and finally honest. The loneliness, the emotional distance, the calculated affection whenever she started pulling away. He hadn't been confused. He had been managing her, like an asset, like a reputation risk. Pearl stared at the documents spread across the desk. Then her eyes landed on another envelope tucked underneath, marked privately. She opened it carefully. Inside was a draft settlement proposal, prepared weeks ago. Cameron's signature already printed at the bottom. Pearl's stomach dropped. He had planned this long before Tuesday, long before the gala, maybe long before she even realized the marriage was dying. The humiliation of that realization burned hotter than the affair itself, because while she was still trying to save them, Cameron had already been planning the exit strategy. Her phone rang again. Cameron. Pearl stared at the screen. Once hearing his name would have softened her instantly. Now it only sharpened her focus. She answered calmly. "You left," he said immediately. "You announced our divorce to strangers. I had no choice." That sentence, always removing responsibility from himself. Pearl leaned back slowly in his chair. "No choice," she repeated. "You've been distant for months, Pearl." There it was. The rewriting, the repositioning of blame. Pearl looked down at the hotel receipts in front of her. "You know what's interesting?" she said softly. "What?" "For the first time in years, I'm not afraid of losing you." Silence. Real silence this time. Not controlled. Not strategic. And for one tiny second, Pearl thought she heard something unexpected in Cameron's breathing. Fear. Then his voice hardened again. "We'll discuss this tomorrow." "No," Pearl replied calmly. "We'll discuss it in court." She hung up before he could answer. And sitting there in the middle of Cameron Reed's perfectly curated office surrounded by evidence of the life he built behind her back, Pearl Holmes finally understood something terrifyingly freeing. The woman who filed on Monday was not the same woman standing at that gala on Tuesday night. That woman had died already, and Cameron still hadn't noticed. By Wednesday morning, Pearl Holmes had already become a story. Not a person, a story. The kind wealthy people whispered about over espresso and green juice inside polished downtown cafes. "Did you hear about Cameron and Pearl Reed? Apparently the marriage has been struggling for years. I always thought she looked unhappy." That one almost made Pearl laugh. People loved rewriting history after disaster made it fashionable. The same women now pretending they always sensed something off were the ones who spent years envying Pearl's marriage online. The penthouse, the vacations in Santorini, the charity galas, the Christmas cards, the perfect Reed Foundation photos where Cameron stood behind Pearl with a hand resting possessively on her waist like she was both wife and trophy. None of them had seen the silence afterward. None of them had seen Pearl eating dinner alone at midnight while Cameron worked late. None of them had seen her crying quietly in bathrooms, so no one would hear how lonely marriage could become. Pearl stood in front of the bathroom mirror that morning, applying concealer beneath her eyes. Not because she had been crying, because she hadn't slept at all. Cameron still hadn't come home. That fact should have devastated her. Instead, it sharpened something cold inside her chest. She tied her hair back slowly and stared at herself. For years, she had trained herself to become smaller emotionally, less demanding, less reactive, less difficult. Every compromise had disguised itself as maturity. Now she wondered whether she had slowly disappeared while calling it love. Her phone buzzed on the marble counter. A text from Savannah Mercer, one of her closest friends, or at least someone Pearl used to think was one. Savannah. Hey, I saw the announcement last night. I'm so sorry. Savannah Cameron seemed really emotional up there. Savannah. Maybe this is healthier for both of you in the long run. Pearl stared at the message. Cameron seemed emotional. Of course he did. Men like Cameron always knew how to perform pain in public, especially when it protected their reputation. Pearl typed nothing back. Instead, she opened Instagram. Mistake. The charity gala photos were already everywhere. Cameron in his tailored black tuxedo, board members beside him, headlines spinning sympathy around him like silk. Finance executive. Cameron Reed announces private family transition, private family transition. Pearl almost threw the phone across the room. They made betrayal sound like corporate restructuring. Another post appeared underneath. A blurry photo of Pearl standing alone near the ballroom windows. Comments flooded beneath it. She looks cold. Honestly, he probably outgrew her. Power couples never last. Outgrew her? Pearl inhaled sharply. That sentence hit deeper than she wanted to admit. Because Cameron had spent years quietly convincing her she was falling behind him. His success became the center of gravity in their marriage. His schedule mattered more. His stress mattered more. His ambitions mattered more. Pearl had slowly rearranged her life around his momentum until she barely recognized her own reflection anymore. And the terrifying part, she thought that was what supportive wives were supposed to do. A memory surfaced suddenly. 3 years earlier, Pearl standing in their kitchen after receiving an offer to join a luxury interior development firm in Manhattan. A dream opportunity. She remembered the excitement trembling in her voice when she told Cameron. And she remembered his smile. That careful smile. "Do you really want more stress right now?" he had asked gently. Not forbidding, never directly controlling. That was Cameron's genius. He made surrender feel reasonable. "You already have enough on your plate," he continued. "Besides, my schedule's getting insane next quarter." So Pearl declined the offer. At the time, it felt loving. Now it felt surgical. Another memory followed immediately after. Pearl at a dinner party laughing too loudly at another man's joke. Later that night, Cameron saying quietly, "You know, sometimes you come across desperate for attention. Not yelling, not fighting, just small comments strategically placed over years until her confidence slowly bled out." Pearl gripped the bathroom counter harder. God, how many pieces of herself had she handed over willingly? Her phone rang again. Harper Lawson. "You need to prepare yourself," Harper said immediately after Pearl answered, "for what Cameron's legal team is beginning narrative positioning." Pearl frowned slightly. Meaning, they're building the image of a disconnected marriage. Emotional incompatibility, mutual decline, standard reputation protection. Pearl laughed bitterly. "So he cheats on me and somehow we both become responsible. Welcome to upper-class divorce litigation." Pearl walked slowly toward Cameron's office again. The black folder still sat where she left it, evidence of his second life. "I found more documents last night," she said quietly. "Anything significant?" "He prepared settlement drafts weeks ago." Harper went silent. "That's useful?" "Useful." Pearl was still adjusting to the language of war. Pain converted into strategy. Betrayal converted into evidence. What about the affair? Pearl asked. Still circumstantial, unless we establish financial crossover. Pearl opened another drawer absent-mindedly while Harper spoke. Inside sat an old leather notebook. Cameron's handwriting. Rare. He almost never wrote anything by hand. Curiosity pulled at her immediately. She opened it. Most pages contained business notes, meeting numbers, investment reminders. Then suddenly, a sentence. Pearl notices patterns too easily. Pearl froze. Another line beneath it. Need to keep emotional balance stable until Q4 transition. Her stomach turned violently. Transition. Was that what he called dismantling their marriage? She kept reading. Avoid confrontation until asset protection's finalized. Pearl's hand began shaking. Not from sadness, from clarity. Cold, horrifying clarity. This wasn't a marriage collapsing naturally. This was a managed extraction. Carefully timed, emotionally calculated. And Cameron had been documenting it like business strategy. Pearl Harper's voice came through the phone. I found something. What Pearl stared at the page again. Suddenly every moment made sense. Every strategically timed apology. Every affection burst right before she reached emotional exhaustion. Every vacation after major arguments. Every expensive gift instead of emotional accountability. He had been stabilizing her emotionally just enough to maintain control. Oh my God, she whispered. What is it? He studied me. Silence. Then Harper spoke carefully. Narcissistic personalities often treat relationships as systems to manage. Pearl closed the notebook slowly. A tear finally escaped down her cheek. Not because she missed him, because she realized how thoroughly she had loved someone who viewed her emotional survival as operational maintenance. That grief was worse. Far worse. The grief of discovering your love was real, and theirs was strategic. Pearl walked toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. Chicago stretched endlessly beneath gray morning clouds. She remembered standing here years ago beside Cameron drinking wine barefoot while he promised, "We'll always choose each other." The memory almost physically hurt. Because maybe he meant it then. Or maybe men like Cameron only love women properly before they fully possess them. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Another message. Unknown. Check the encrypted drive in the lower cabinet. Unknown, if you want to know who your husband really is, start there. Pearl's pulse slowed instantly. Not fear. Instinct. Someone inside Cameron's world was feeding her information deliberately, which meant one terrifying thing: Cameron Reed had enemies. Real ones. And suddenly Pearl understood that her marriage might have been built on far darker foundations than infidelity alone. She walked slowly toward the lower cabinet beside Cameron's desk. Locked. But now she knew something important. Cameron hid things because he assumed Pearl would never stop being the trusting wife he created. He had no idea that version of her was already gone. Pearl crouched slowly beside the cabinet, and for the first time since the gala, she smiled. Not from happiness, from awakening, because Cameron Reed still believed he was controlling the story, while Pearl Holmes was finally beginning to read the full script. The lower cabinet required a fingerprint. Of course it did. Pearl sat back slowly on her heels, staring at the small biometric scanner glowing faintly blue beneath the desk. Cameron had installed it 6 months earlier during what he casually described as a security upgrade. At the time, she hadn't questioned it. Because wives in marriages like hers slowly stop questioning things. Not suddenly, gradually, like water wearing down stone. Pearl stood and walked toward the kitchen, her bare feet cold against the marble floors. The penthouse was still silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and distant traffic 30 stories below. Cameron still wasn't home. That fact no longer felt accidental. It felt operational. Her mind replayed Harper's words from earlier. Narcissistic personalities treat relationships as systems to manage. The terrifying part wasn't that Cameron cheated. The terrifying part was how organized he had been while doing it. Pearl opened the freezer absently, staring at the untouched ice trays. Then suddenly she remembered. 3 months ago, Cameron sliced his thumb open while cooking during one of his rare good husband evenings. She had rushed for the first aid kit while he pressed his bleeding thumb against a wine glass, leaving a dark fingerprint smudged near the base, before tossing it into the freezer to numb the cut. Pearl froze, then slowly smiled. Not warmly, strategically. 10 minutes later, she stood back inside Cameron's office, holding the old wine glass wrapped carefully in a dish towel. "Let's see how perfect you really are," she whispered. The scanner blinked red once, then green. The cabinet unlocked with a soft mechanical click. Pearl's pulse slowed immediately. Not panic, focus. Inside sat 3 external hard drives, stacks of financial folders, and a sealed envelope marked confidential. She pulled out the first hard drive and connected it to Cameron's laptop. Password protected. But taped beneath the drive in Cameron's own handwriting, NB1022, Natalie Brooks. October 22nd. Pearl felt physically sick. Not from jealousy anymore. From intimacy. Affairs are ugly enough. But seeing another woman's initials casually integrated into password systems routines, that was a different kind of cruelty. The files loaded slowly onto the screen. Investment spreadsheets, property acquisitions, wire transfers. Then Pearl noticed something strange. Several transactions had been routed through shell companies connected to Cameron's corporate division. Large amounts. Very large. Luxury penthouse lease in Manhattan. Private travel expenses. Jewelry purchases. Monthly transfers into an account registered under Natalie Brooks Consulting, LLC. Pearl stared at the number. $18,000 monthly. Her chest tightened sharply. He wasn't just sleeping with Natalie. He was funding an entire hidden life. A memory surfaced instantly. Cameron once criticizing Pearl for replacing the dining chairs because the originals were still functional. "You're becoming careless with money," he had said coldly. Meanwhile, he was financing another woman's luxury apartment. Pearl laughed under her breath. The sound felt dangerous now, because grief was slowly evolving into something far sharper. Another folder opened automatically. Photos. Pearl stopped breathing. Cameron and Natalie in Miami. Cameron and Natalie boarding a yacht. Cameron kissing her forehead outside a Manhattan hotel. The intimacy in the photos hurt more than the sex would have, because Cameron looked relaxed, happy, present. Expressions Pearl hadn't seen directed at her in years. Pearl clicked another image. Date stamp, December 14th. Their anniversary, again. She closed her eyes briefly. That night replayed painfully in fragments. Pearl sitting alone at their dining table beside untouched candles. Calling Cameron twice. Him finally answering hours later with airport noise in the background. "Baby, I'm so sorry. Investor crisis. I'll make it up to you." She remembered believing him instantly. Not because she was stupid, because love makes trust feel morally correct. Now she wondered how many women destroy themselves trying to remain understanding. Her phone buzzed. Harper. Pearl answered immediately. "I got into the cabinet. Tell me everything." Pearl began listing transactions mechanically while scrolling through files. Harper interrupted twice to ask for screenshots. Then silence filled the line again. Finally, Harper spoke carefully. "Pearl, this is bigger than infidelity. I know. These financial movements could become corporate liability." Pearl leaned back slowly in Cameron's chair. Outside the office windows, gray rain clouds rolled over Chicago like bruises across the sky. "He built another life," Pearl whispered. Harper's voice softened slightly. "No. He borrowed resources from your shared life to manufacture another one." That distinction landed hard. Because Harper was right. Cameron hadn't built anything alone. Pearl had supported him emotionally for years while he climbed professionally. Hosted dinners, managed appearances, protected his image, smoothed every sharp edge of his career with unpaid emotional labor no one acknowledged. And while she was doing that, he was transferring their shared future into someone else's hands. Pearl opened another folder. This one froze her completely, labeled Asset Protection Timeline. Her stomach dropped instantly. The document contained dates, strategies, projected divorce outcomes, estimated emotional response likelihoods. Pearl's hands began trembling. No, 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 no. She scrolled faster. One line punched directly through her chest, Pearl unlikely to pursue aggressive litigation due to emotional dependency patterns. Pearl physically recoiled from the screen. Emotional dependency patterns. Like she was a psychological profile instead of a wife. Another line beneath it, maintain controlled affection through Q3 to avoid instability before restructuring. Controlled affection. The room suddenly felt too small. Pearl stood abruptly pacing once across the office as rage finally started burning through the numbness. Not loud rage. The dangerous kind. The quiet kind that arrives after humiliation hardens into clarity. Every vacation, every apology, every bouquet of flowers after emotional distance. Managed, timed, engineered. Tears blurred her vision suddenly not from heartbreak, but from humiliation at how long she had mistaken manipulation for inconsistency. Her entire marriage had become a behavioral management system, and Cameron documented it like quarterly planning. A new notification appeared on the laptop. Incoming message preview. From Natalie Brooks. Pearl froze instantly. Natalie. Did she react badly at the gala? Natalie. You promised this would be over soon, Natalie. I'm tired of feeling hidden. Pearl stared at the words. Then another message arrived. Natalie. Sometimes I think you enjoy controlling both worlds too much. Pearl's heartbeat slowed. That message mattered. Because Natalie wasn't just emotionally involved. She was frustrated. And frustrated people became careless. Pearl quickly screenshotted everything. Then another realization hit her suddenly. Cameron didn't know she had access. Meaning for the first time in years, Pearl held informational power. Real power. A sound interrupted the silence. The front door opening. Pearl's entire body stiffened. Cameron. She immediately disconnected the drive and shut the cabinet quietly. Footsteps moved through the penthouse slowly. Measured. Confident. Pearl remained seated in his office chair. Waiting. Seconds later, Cameron appeared in the doorway. He stopped instantly when he saw her sitting there. A flicker crossed his face. Tiny, but real. Fear. Then it vanished beneath composure. You're up early, he said carefully. Pearl looked at him for a long moment. God. He was still beautiful. That was the cruel thing about certain men. Their faces stay soft long after their souls harden. You were gone all night, she replied calmly. I needed space. Space. Another sanitized word. Pearl studied him quietly. Cameron loosened his tie slightly, watching her with increasing caution now. Something about her expression was wrong. Different. Too calm. Too still. You okay? He finally asked. Pearl almost laughed at the absurdity. He had publicly destroyed their marriage 48 hours ago, and now he was asking if she was okay. I'm learning, she said softly. His eyes narrowed slightly, learning what Pearl stood slowly from the chair. Then she smiled. Not warmly, not lovingly, like someone finally seeing the shape of the battlefield clearly. Who I married, for the first time since the gala. Cameron Reed looked genuinely unsettled. And Pearl realized something powerful in that moment. The most dangerous thing a manipulative man can witness is the exact second his victim stops needing his version of reality. By Friday night, Pearl Holmes understood something dangerous about herself. She was no longer afraid of the truth. That was new. For years she had sensed things and then deliberately softened them in her own mind. Women married to powerful men learn that survival often depends on selective blindness. You ignore the late-night texts. You ignore the emotional distance. You ignore how your husband suddenly starts protecting his phone like classified government property, because admitting the truth means detonating your own life. But now, The explosion had already happened, and standing in the ashes felt strangely liberating. Pearl adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist as the driver pulled up outside the Ashford Hotel downtown. Another charity event. Another polished room full of wealthy executives pretending morality and money naturally belong together. Normally, Cameron would have arrived beside her. Tonight, she came alone. And that mattered. The valet's expression shifted almost imperceptibly when he recognized her. Pity again. God, she hated pity. Pearl stepped out of the car in a fitted ivory silk dress that made people stare the second she entered the lobby. Not because it was provocative, because she looked composed. That confused people. They expected devastated wives to arrive looking destroyed. Pearl looked expensive instead. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and carefully curated conversations. Waiters moved elegantly between clusters of powerful people exchanging money, influence, and lies disguised as networking. And somewhere inside this room, Natalie Brooks was waiting. Pearl spotted her within minutes. Tall, blonde, sharp cheekbones, early 30s, beautiful in the deliberate way women become beautiful when they know men reward them for it. Natalie stood beside two investors, laughing softly, one hand resting against a champagne glass, while the other touched her necklace absent-mindedly. Cameron bought her that necklace. Pearl knew instantly, because she helped him choose it. 3 months earlier, he told Pearl it was a corporate gift for a client's wife. The memory hit like acid. For one brief second, rage surged violently through her chest. Not because Natalie was prettier. She wasn't. Not because Cameron desired someone else, but because both of them had looked directly into Pearl's face while lying to her repeatedly. That level of intimacy inside betrayal felt monstrous. Natalie noticed her. The reaction was immediate. Tiny stiffening of posture, eyes widening slightly, then composure returning almost instantly. Interesting. So Cameron hadn't told Natalie how much Pearl already knew. Pearl smiled politely and walked toward the bar. Several women approached almost immediately. Sympathy vultures. Pearl, sweetheart, we've been thinking about you. I can't imagine how difficult this must be. Their voices blended together like perfume-heavy static. Pearl answered gracefully automatically, years of upper-class social conditioning carrying her through the interaction. But her attention remained fixed on Natalie across the room. Watching, measuring, Natalie kept glancing toward her. Nervous now. Good. A man beside Pearl lowered his voice carefully. Cameron's taking some heat with the board after the announcement. Pearl turned slightly. Is he? Timing wasn't ideal. Timing. Always timing. Nobody cared about morality in Cameron's world. Only optics. Pearl accepted a champagne glass from the bartender and finally decided something. She was done hiding from discomfort. So she crossed the ballroom directly toward Natalie Brooks. The tension became immediate. People sensed things before they understood them. Conversations nearby softened slightly as Pearl approached. Natalie straightened. Pearl, she said smoothly. Interesting. Not Mrs. Reed. Not awkward confusion. Just Pearl. Meaning Cameron had discussed her extensively. Pearl smiled faintly. Natalie. Up close, Natalie looked younger than Pearl expected, and nervous. Not guilty, just uncertain. You look beautiful tonight, Natalie offered carefully. The audacity almost impressed Pearl. Thank you, she replied calmly. So do you. A pause stretched between them, sharp enough to cut skin. Natalie took a sip of champagne. I know this situation is probably painful. Probably painful. Pearl studied her carefully. Natalie wasn't cruel exactly, just entitled. The kind of woman who convinces herself emotional collateral damage becomes acceptable once a man claims he's unhappy. And Cameron was probably very convincing. He talks about you often, Pearl said softly. Natalie blinked. Not expecting that. He does all the time. Natalie visibly relaxed slightly. There it was. Validation. Women in affairs always wanted confirmation that they mattered emotionally. Pearl almost felt sorry for her. Almost. He said your marriage has been over for years, Natalie continued cautiously. Pearl smiled again. Controlled. Elegant. Dangerous. Did he? Natalie hesitated now. Something about Pearl's calmness was becoming unsettling. He said you stopped loving him a long time ago. That one landed differently, because it was almost funny. Pearl had spent years begging emotionally for scraps of affection while Cameron slowly disappeared from their marriage. And somehow she became the emotionally unavailable one in his version of events. Classic. He's very talented at storytelling, Pearl replied. Natalie's eyes narrowed slightly. You think he's lying to me? Pearl tilted her head thoughtfully. No. I think Cameron lies differently to different women. Silence. Heavy now. Around them, conversations continued. Glasses clinked soft jazz played through hidden speakers, but inside that tiny pocket of space between the two women, something much darker unfolded. Natalie recovered quickly. You know, she said carefully, sometimes relationships end because people outgrow each other. There it was. The justification. The elegant moral packaging affairs always wore. Pearl took a slow sip of champagne before answering. You sound exactly like him. Natalie's confidence flickered. Just slightly. Pearl leaned in closer, not aggressively, almost gently. Did he tell you he prepared divorce documents weeks ago? Natalie froze. A tiny reaction. But enough. Pearl saw it instantly. No. He hadn't told her that. Interesting. He told me things were complicated, Natalie replied carefully. Pearl smiled sadly this time. For the first time all evening, genuine emotion touched her face. Men like Cameron always need women to believe they're trapped, she said quietly. It makes betrayal sound romantic instead of selfish. Natalie's jaw tightened. You don't know everything. Pearl looked directly into her eyes. No, she said softly. But I'm beginning to. That unsettled Natalie more than anger would have. Because rage can be dismissed. Calm women are harder to control. A voice interrupted behind them. Pearl, Cameron, of course. Pearl turned slowly. God. Even now he knew how to enter a room. Tailored charcoal suit, controlled expression, powerful presence refined through years of executive leadership and public admiration. People noticed Cameron Reed instinctively. That was part of his danger. He moved closer, carefully eyes shifting once between Pearl and Natalie. Calculation happening in real time. You two know each other, he asked lightly. Too lightly. Pearl almost smiled. Natalie answered first. We were just talking. Cameron studied Pearl's face carefully, trying to read damage, trying to read emotional instability, trying to determine how much control remained. Pearl looked at him calmly, then at Natalie, then back to Cameron, and suddenly she understood the full shape of the triangle he built. Cameron didn't love conflict. He loved management. Keeping women emotionally separated from each other kept him powerful. But tonight, for the first time, that system cracked slightly. Pearl stepped closer toward Cameron, smoothing invisible wrinkles from his lapel gently like a loving wife. The intimacy of the gesture visibly confused him. Then she spoke softly enough that only he could hear, she starting to ask questions. Cameron's face changed instantly. Tiny shift. Tiny panic. But Pearl saw it. And once you see fear in someone manipulative, you can never unsee it again. Natalie looked between them uncertainly now. What does that mean? Pearl stepped back gracefully. Oh, she said softly, nothing yet. Yet. That word lingered heavily. Then Pearl smiled politely at both of them. I should let you enjoy your evening. She turned calmly and walked away through the ballroom. But halfway toward the exit, her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Unknown Natalie Brooks isn't the biggest secret. Unknown check Cameron's Manhattan acquisitions. Pearl stopped walking. Her pulse slowed instantly. Not the biggest secret, cold realization spread through her chest. The affair wasn't the center of this story. It was only the surface. And somewhere behind Cameron Reed's carefully constructed life, something much uglier was waiting to be uncovered. By the second week after the gala, Cameron Reed began losing his rhythm. Not publicly. Publicly, he was still polished perfection, still walking into boardrooms with tailored suits and controlled confidence, still speaking in measured tones during interviews, still charming investors with that dangerous calm that made people trust him before they truly knew him. But privately, he was unsettled, because Pearl Holmes had stopped reacting, and manipulative people panic when their emotional access disappears. The penthouse had become eerily quiet. No arguments, no crying, no accusations. Pearl moved through the space with almost surgical calmness now. She woke early, worked out, took calls with Harper, organized documents, drank coffee by the windows overlooking Lake Michigan like a woman preparing for something far bigger than heartbreak. Cameron watched her carefully. That was the part she noticed most. He watched her now, as if trying to locate the emotional woman he used to manage so easily. But she was gone. On Monday morning, Cameron entered the kitchen while Pearl sat reading financial reports on her tablet. "You've been avoiding me?" he said casually. Pearl looked up slowly. "No," she replied. "I've been observing you." That answer visibly bothered him. "Good." Cameron opened the refrigerator, buying himself a few seconds to recover composure. "You're making this colder than it needs to be." Pearl almost smiled. Everything with him returned to emotional optics eventually. Not morality. Comfort, convenience, coldness, difficulty, need. He framed emotions like business obstacles. She watched him pour coffee into his favorite black ceramic mug, the one she bought him in Seattle during their 7th anniversary trip, back when they still touched each other naturally, back before every kiss started feeling scheduled. "Did you love her?" Pearl asked suddenly. Cameron froze only briefly before continuing to stir his coffee. "That's not a productive question." There, not denial, not even outrage, just strategic avoidance. Pearl leaned back in her chair. "You know what's strange," she said softly. "I thought finding out about Natalie would destroy me." His eyes flickered toward her immediately, but it didn't. Now he was listening carefully. "Do you know what actually hurt?" Pearl continued calmly. Cameron stayed silent. "The realization that I kept shrinking myself to make you comfortable." That landed harder than she expected, because Cameron's jaw tightened instantly. People like him understood criticism of behavior, but criticism of character that threatened identity. "I never asked you to shrink yourself," he replied carefully. Pearl laughed softly. "No, you just rewarded me every time I did." Silence filled the kitchen. Heavy, intelligent, dangerous. Cameron moved closer slowly, leaning against the marble counter across from her. "You think I manipulated you. I think you curated me." That word hit him. She saw it immediately, because it was true. Cameron didn't scream, didn't rage, didn't control through obvious dominance. He shaped environments emotionally until people adjusted themselves around him naturally. Boardrooms, friend groups, relationships. Everything bent subtly toward Cameron Reed eventually. Except now, Pearl wasn't bending anymore. His phone buzzed against the counter suddenly. A message preview lit the screen. Natalie. Cameron grabbed it too quickly, too defensively. Pearl noticed. Of course she noticed. But unlike before, she didn't react. That unsettled him more than jealousy ever could. "I have a meeting downtown," Cameron said shortly. Pearl nodded once and returned to her tablet. No fight. No emotional demand. No attempt to stop him. He lingered there awkwardly for a moment longer, almost as if expecting something. Then he left. The second the front door closed, Pearl exhaled slowly. Not sadness, fatigue, because emotional detachment required discipline when your heart still remembered loving someone. Her phone rang immediately afterward. Harper Lawson. "How'd this morning go?" He's starting to notice the silence. "Good." Pearl walked slowly toward the office windows. Rain covered Chicago again in gray softness. The city always looked lonelier in bad weather. I don't think he understands why I'm not breaking, Pearl admitted quietly, because men like Cameron mistake emotional regulation for emotional dependence. Pearl frowned slightly, meaning Harper's voice sharpened professionally. He assumed your love made you controllable. Pearl closed her eyes briefly. God. That sentence explained everything. Every calculated apology. Every emotional withdrawal followed by affection. Every cycle designed to destabilize, then soothe. Not consciously evil, perhaps, but deeply selfish. And now Pearl asked, now he's losing access to the emotional system he relied on. Pearl stared down at the streets below. Tiny people moving through crosswalks, unaware her entire life had become strategic warfare. Harper continued, you need to keep documenting everything. I am. Good. Especially verbal interactions. Pearl glanced toward Cameron's office instinctively. That room had become a graveyard of revelations. I found more transfers last night, she said quietly. Anything significant? Manhattan acquisitions tied to shell companies. Harper went silent again. Then carefully, that's dangerous money. Pearl's pulse slowed slightly. Dangerous how I need more documentation before I say anything definitive. Which meant yes. Very dangerous. That night Cameron came home unusually early. Another tactic. Pearl recognized patterns now. Whenever he sensed emotional distance increasing, he reintroduced controlled intimacy. He entered carrying takeout bags from her favorite Italian restaurant downtown. 3 weeks ago, that gesture would have softened her instantly. Now she saw it clearly, behavioral stabilization. You remembered, she said neutrally. Cameron studied her expression carefully. I'm trying. Trying what? To save the marriage, or the version of himself reflected inside it. They ate dinner quietly. Cameron attempted light conversation twice. Pearl answered politely but briefly. The emotional imbalance became increasingly obvious. For years, Cameron controlled relational pacing. Now Pearl did. And he hated it. After dinner, Cameron poured whiskey while Pearl cleaned the kitchen. You don't have to do that, he said. Pearl rinsed a wine glass slowly. I know. Another small thing. Another disruption. Because Pearl used to perform care automatically. Now every kindness became intentional. Chosen. No longer extracted through expectation. Later that night, Cameron stepped onto the balcony for a phone call. Pearl wasn't trying to eavesdrop initially, but then she heard Natalie's name. She froze quietly near the hallway. Cameron's voice lowered instantly. I told you to stop texting so much. Pause. No, she doesn't know everything. Another pause. Then something shifted in his tone. Sharper now. She won't fight back Natalie. Pearl's entire body stilled. Outside wind moved violently across the balcony curtains while Cameron continued speaking. She never does. The words sliced through her cleanly. Not because they hurt, because they clarified everything. That was how he saw her. Predictable, manageable, emotionally compliant. A woman who absorbed damage quietly. Pearl reached slowly into her robe pocket, pulled out her phone, and pressed record. Cameron continued talking outside, unaware. I just need time to stabilize things financially. Pearl's pulse slowed. Financially. There it was again. Always strategy. Always positioning. Never remorse. She recorded every word, every arrogant assumption, every careless confession. And standing there in the dim hallway of the penthouse she once called home, Pearl Holmes realized something irreversible. Cameron Reed had spent years underestimating her because kindness made him confuse her with weakness. But kind women are dangerous once they stop protecting the people hurting them. The balcony door slid open suddenly. Pearl calmly tucked her phone away. Cameron looked at her carefully. How long have you been standing there? Pearl met his gaze evenly. Long enough. Something unreadable passed through his expression. Not guilt. Concern. Because for the first time since the marriage began collapsing, Cameron Reed finally understood he no longer knew what Pearl Holmes was capable of. And that terrified him more than losing her ever had. 3 days later, Cameron Reed walked into his office and realized something was wrong. Not visibly wrong, nothing dramatic, no screaming investors, no collapsing stock numbers flashing across financial news screens. But powerful men develop instincts for instability long before evidence appears, and Cameron felt it immediately. People stopped talking when he entered the executive conference room, only for half a second. But half a second was enough. His assistant avoided eye contact while handing him the morning briefing packet. 2 board members who usually greeted him warmly barely acknowledged him. Something had shifted. Cameron sat at the head of the polished black conference table, adjusting his cufflinks slowly while studying the room. Control the room first. That was always his rule. But today the room felt different. Cautious. Measured. Watching him instead of following him. "Let's begin," Cameron said evenly. The quarterly strategy meeting started normally enough. Revenue projections. Expansion discussions. Investor positioning. Then Victor Hale spoke. "We need to address reputational exposure." The room went still instantly. Victor Hale rarely wasted words. Silver-haired, brutally intelligent, and one of the few executives old enough not to fear Cameron personally, Victor had built half the company's infrastructure before Cameron ever became its public face. Cameron leaned back slightly. What kind of exposure? Victor folded his hands calmly. The gala announcement created unnecessary market chatter. There it was. Cameron maintained composure perfectly. "My personal life doesn't affect company performance." "Usually no," Victor replied. "But public instability creates investor anxiety." Investor anxiety. Corporate language for blood in the water. Another executive shifted awkwardly before adding, "There are already online discussions questioning financial overlap between personal and corporate expenditures." Cameron's pulse slowed instantly. Danger. Real danger now. But externally, he remained calm. Based on what exactly? Silence. Too much silence. That bothered him more than accusations would have. Because silence meant people were already talking privately. Someone cleared their throat. Luxury travel records surfaced online this morning. Cameron's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for Victor. Always enough for Victor. The older man watched him carefully across the table. "Nothing illegal has been implied," Victor continued calmly. Yet. Cameron closed the briefing folder slowly. "Then perhaps we should avoid turning gossip into formal discussion." Nobody answered immediately. That was new too. Because Cameron Reed was used to immediate agreement. People usually adjusted themselves around his confidence naturally. But confidence weakens once doubt enters the ecosystem. And doubt had entered. Meanwhile, 30 floors below Pearl Holmes sat inside Harper Lawson's office reviewing corporate share structures. The contrast between her emotional state now and 2 weeks earlier felt almost unreal. She still hurt. Still woke up some nights unable to breathe through the grief properly. Still occasionally remembered old versions of Cameron and felt physically sick from missing a man who may never have existed fully. But pain was no longer controlling her decisions. Clarity was. Harper slid another folder across the desk. "Your trust shares matter more than Cameron realized." Pearl frowned slightly. "Explain." "The Reed Foundation and Reed Capital overlap in several philanthropic investment structures." Pearl looked down at the documents. Numbers, partnership maps, board voting percentages. "I thought Cameron controlled everything." Harper almost smiled. "That's because he wanted you to think that." Pearl leaned back slowly. For years, Cameron handled the financial world while Pearl remained intentionally distant from it. Not because she lacked intelligence, because he framed disinterest as elegance. "You don't need to stress about these things," he used to tell her gently. Now she understood. Information imbalance creates power, imbalance, and Cameron had spent years protecting his informational advantage carefully. Harper tapped a highlighted section. These trust structures originated from your family contributions. Pearl blinked. My father's investments, yes. Realization spread slowly through her chest. The Reed Empire. Cameron, projected as self-made success, was partially built on money connected to Pearl's family, and he had spent years subtly minimizing that fact publicly. Oh my God, Pearl whispered. Harper nodded once. He needed you emotionally dependent. But legally, financially, you're much harder to erase. Pearl stared out the office windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Outside, the city moved through gray afternoon light, while her understanding of her marriage kept mutating into something darker. Cameron didn't just betray her emotionally, he strategically reduced her perception of her own value. That realization changed everything. Her phone buzzed suddenly. Unknown number again. Unknown Victor Hale knows more than you think. Unknown Cameron buried 2 executives before he came after you. Pearl stared at the message carefully. Victor Hale. Interesting. Harper noticed immediately. Another anonymous source. Pearl nodded slowly. Whoever this is, Harper said carefully, they're feeding you targeted information. Why? Either they want Cameron exposed, or they want protection when he falls. Falls. The word lingered heavily between them, because suddenly, for the first time, Cameron Reed actually looked vulnerable. Not emotionally, structurally. That evening, Pearl attended a private board dinner Cameron assumed she would skip. The moment she entered the restaurant, conversations visibly shifted. Not pity this time. Curiosity. Good. Pearl wore black tonight. Simple. Elegant. Severe enough to feel intentional. Cameron stood near the wine display speaking with investors when he noticed her. The reaction was immediate. Confusion first. Then caution. Because Pearl arriving meant variables he hadn't prepared for. Pearl, he said carefully as she approached. She smiled politely. Cameron. The investors nearby suddenly became fascinated by their drinks. Cowards. One older board member stepped forward awkwardly. Good to see you, Pearl. Is it? She asked softly. The man flushed instantly. Cameron's eyes narrowed slightly. Warning. But Pearl no longer cared about his warnings. Dinner began with strained politeness. Corporate discussions filled the table, while underneath everything ran another conversation entirely: who still trusted Cameron Reed, and who no longer did. Pearl noticed things now she used to miss. Executives hesitating before agreeing with him. Subtle glances exchanged after he spoke, the tiny cracks forming beneath his authority. Then Victor Hale arrived late. The atmosphere changed instantly. Victor carried old money calmness like armor. Nothing about him needed approval. He greeted Cameron briefly before turning toward Pearl. And for the first time all evening, someone looked directly at her without pity. Mrs. Holmes, Victor said evenly. Holmes, not Reed. Pearl noticed immediately. Mr. Hale. Victor sat across from Cameron slowly. The tension sharpened. Throughout dinner, Victor challenged Cameron more openly than anyone else dared. Minor disagreements, strategic corrections, questions phrased politely enough to avoid conflict, but directly enough to destabilize authority. Cameron stayed composed externally. But Pearl saw it now. The tiny fracture lines in his control. Halfway through dessert, Cameron excused himself for a phone call. The second he disappeared, silence settled briefly across the table. Then Victor looked directly at Pearl. You seem remarkably calm considering the circumstances. Pearl met his gaze steadily. Maybe I spent too many years preparing for this without realizing it. Something almost like respect flickered across Victor's face. Interesting. Then he lowered his voice slightly. Cameron mistakes quiet people for powerless people. Pearl's pulse slowed instantly. This wasn't casual conversation anymore. Victor continued carefully. That has historically been a very expensive mistake. Before Pearl could answer, Cameron returned. The conversation ended instantly. But the message remained. Historically. Meaning there were others before her. Others Cameron underestimated. The dinner ended an hour later beneath fake smiles and expensive lies. As guests filtered toward the valet area, Cameron finally cornered Pearl near the elevators. "What exactly are you doing?" he asked quietly. Pearl tilted her head slightly. "Attending dinner." "You know what I mean." His voice had changed. Still controlled, but thinner now. Pressure underneath it. Pearl looked at him carefully. For years, this man had dominated every room they entered together. Now, for the first time, he looked tired. Not guilty. Threatened. "I'm learning your world," Pearl said softly. Cameron's jaw tightened. "That world isn't for you." That sentence. God. There it was again. The quiet superiority. The assumption that he remained gatekeeper to power, intelligence, influence. Pearl smiled faintly. "That's the problem, Cameron," she replied. "You spent so long convincing me I didn't belong in your world. You forgot how much of it was built through me." He stared at her silently. No immediate response. Because she was right. And people like Cameron hate truth most when it arrives calmly. Pearl stepped into the elevator. The doors began closing slowly between them. Then Cameron spoke suddenly. "Who's feeding you information?" Pearl held his gaze evenly as the gap narrowed. Interesting. So now he knew someone inside his system was leaking. Fear flickered across his face again. Tiny. Controlled. But real. Pearl smiled softly and let the elevator doors close without answering. Because Cameron Reed finally understood something terrifying. The woman he thought he managed emotionally for years had started becoming unpredictable. And unpredictable women are dangerous to men who built empires on control. Pearl Holmes met Victor Hale 3 days later in a private whiskey bar, hidden beneath an old hotel downtown. The location itself felt intentional. Dark wood walls, low amber lighting, no influencers taking photos, no executives pretending morality existed between investment deals. Just silence, expensive liquor, and secrets. Victor sat alone in the far corner booth when Pearl arrived. No assistant, no security, no performance. That unsettled her more than arrogance would have. Because truly powerful men rarely need witnesses. Victor stood politely as she approached. "Pearl." She noticed again that he refused to call her Mrs. Reed. Like Cameron's name no longer belonged attached to her. "Mr. Hale." "Victor," he corrected calmly. Pearl sat across from him slowly. The bartender arrived immediately. "Same," he asked Victor. Victor nodded once before glancing toward Pearl. "Wine bourbon," she answered. Victor's eyebrow lifted slightly. "Interesting. Good. Let him underestimate her a little first." The bartender disappeared. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Pearl studied him carefully instead. Victor Hale looked like the kind of man who survived corporate America by becoming emotionally impossible to intimidate. Mid-60s, sharp gray eyes, expensive watch worn loosely like money bored him. But there was something else too. Weariness. Like he had spent decades watching people destroy themselves for power. "You wanted to talk," Pearl finally said. Victor leaned back slightly. "No, I wanted to see whether you were smart enough to ask questions." Pearl almost smiled. "And I haven't decided yet." The bourbon arrived. Pearl took a slow sip without breaking eye contact. Victor noticed that too. "Good. Who's been sending me information?" she asked directly. Victor's expression didn't change. "Does it matter?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because people don't risk themselves without motives." A faint smile touched Victor's mouth. "There she is." Pearl frowned slightly. The woman Cameron spent years trying to keep emotionally distracted. That sentence landed hard. Not because it hurt, because it confirmed what Pearl already suspected people around Cameron noticed more than she realized. Victor folded his hands slowly. "You know what Cameron's biggest weakness is?" Pearl answered immediately. "Control." Victor nodded once. "Close. His actual weakness is certainty." The bar remained quiet around them, while rain tapped softly against street-level windows above. Victor continued. "Cameron Reed believes he understands people completely, especially loyal people." Pearl stared at her bourbon. Loyal people. Women like her. Supportive wives. Emotionally dependable humans who kept systems stable while ambitious men climbed over them. He always thought kindness meant predictability, Victor added. Pearl looked back up slowly. And what does it actually mean? Victor's eyes sharpened slightly. That someone chose not to destroy you when they had reasons to. Silence settled heavily between them. Because suddenly Pearl understood something chilling. Cameron's greatest miscalculation wasn't cheating. It was assuming Pearl's restraint came from weakness instead of character. Victor pulled a thin folder from beside him and slid it carefully across the table. Pearl looked down at it. What is this history? She opened it slowly. Inside were legal settlements, corporate resignation records, non-disclosure agreements, and photographs. One image immediately caught her attention. A woman standing outside a courthouse crying while reporters surrounded her. The headline beneath it read, "Former Reed Capital Executive Resigns Amid Ethics Investigation." Pearl frowned. I don't understand. Victor leaned back. Her name was Dana Mercer. Mercer. Pearl froze. Savannah Mercer. Her friend. Oh, God. Savannah's sister Pearl whispered. Victor nodded. Shock moved coldly through Pearl's chest. She worked directly under Cameron 6 years ago. What happened? Victor's jaw tightened subtly. Officially, financial misconduct allegations. And unofficially, Victor looked directly at her. She rejected him. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Pearl stared at him silently. No, she whispered automatically. Victor's expression hardened. You think Natalie Brooks was the first woman Cameron used professionally? Pearl couldn't breathe properly for a second. No, Dana reported inappropriate conduct internally. 2 months later, she became the center of a compliance investigation. Pearl's stomach turned violently. What happened to her? She lost everything. The words landed like stones. She couldn't prove retaliation, Victor continued calmly. Cameron protected himself carefully. He always does. Pearl looked back down at the photo. A woman destroyed publicly. A woman she had unknowingly met once years earlier at a holiday event. Savannah told everyone Dana became unstable after workplace stress. But now Pearl saw the pattern. Not instability, isolation, discrediting, narrative management, exactly what Cameron tried building against her already. Why didn't anyone stop him? Pearl asked quietly. Victor gave a humorless smile. Because men like Cameron produce profits. That answer felt disgustingly realistic. Victor took a slow sip of whiskey before continuing. You need to understand something important, Pearl. She looked up. The affair isn't the story. Her pulse slowed instantly. Then what was? Victor leaned slightly closer. Cameron has spent years using emotional leverage to secure financial leverage. Pearl frowned. Meaning he builds dependency first, then uses trust to access control. The sentence unlocked something terrifying inside her memory. Every time Cameron encouraged her to step away from professional opportunities. Every time he positioned himself as the decision-maker. Every time he framed dependence as intimacy. Not necessarily because he consciously planned evil, but because power became instinctive for him. Victor continued quietly. Natalie Brooks isn't just a mistress. Pearl's heartbeat quickened slightly. She manages one of the Manhattan acquisition pipelines. Pearl froze. The shell companies. Victor nodded. Cold realization spread through her chest. So Natalie wasn't merely emotional escape. She was operational, integrated into Cameron's financial structure. How deep does this go? Pearl asked softly. Victor stared at her for a long moment before answering. Deep enough that people inside Reed Capital are preparing exit strategies. Jesus. The company was destabilizing faster than Pearl realized. Victor lowered his voice further. Cameron's problem is that he started believing he was untouchable. Pearl thought about the gala again. The public announcement, the confidence, the arrogance. He truly believed he controlled every narrative in his life. Then Victor said something that chilled her completely. You're not the first woman he underestimated. Pearl swallowed slowly. But you might be the first one emotionally detached enough to survive him. That hurt more than she expected. Because it was true. 3 months ago, she would have protected Cameron instinctively despite everything. Now she was finally seeing him clearly. And clarity changes people permanently. Victor stood suddenly. We should leave separately. Pearl blinked. Why? Victor looked toward the staircase leading upstairs. Because Cameron's already suspicious. Her pulse slowed instantly. You think he knows we met? I think Cameron monitors threats before they fully form. Threats? Interesting. Pearl stood too, gathering the folder carefully. Victor adjusted his coat before looking at her one last time. Be careful who you trust now. Does that include you? Victor smiled faintly. Especially me. Then he walked away without another word. Pearl remained standing alone beside the booth for several seconds afterward. The folder felt heavier in her hands now. Not because of paper, because of implication. Dana Mercer, Natalie Brooks, corporate retaliation, emotional manipulation, financial concealment. The story kept expanding outward into something uglier than betrayal. Her phone buzzed suddenly. Cameron. Pearl stared at the screen, then answered calmly. Where are you? He asked immediately. Interesting. No greeting. No softness. Just monitoring. Out. With who? Pearl smiled faintly to herself. There it was. Control destabilizing. You sound nervous, she said softly. Silence. Then Cameron's voice lowered. Pearl, stop playing games. Games. God. Manipulative men always called it games once women stopped surrendering information freely. Pearl walked slowly toward the stairs. I learned from the best, she replied quietly. Then she hung up. Outside, rain covered Chicago in silver reflections, while headlights blurred across wet streets. Pearl stood beneath the hotel awning, clutching Victor's folder tightly against her chest. And for the first time since the marriage exploded, she stopped seeing herself as the abandoned wife in Cameron Reed's story. Now she saw herself differently. Not victim, not survivor. Witness. To a man whose carefully curated empire was beginning to crack from the inside. And somewhere deep beneath the grief, Pearl Holmes felt something dangerous beginning to bloom. Not revenge, not yet. Power. By the end of October, Pearl Holmes no longer recognized her own life. It had transformed into calendars, evidence folders, encrypted backups, and strategy meetings inside Harper Lawson's office overlooking downtown Chicago. Pain had become administrative. That was the strangest part. The human heart could shatter completely while the world still demanded signatures, timelines, and legal precision. Pearl sat across from Harper at the massive walnut conference table while city lights flickered outside the windows. 3 folders rested between them. Financial exposure, corporate intersections, behavioral documentation. Harper tapped the last folder carefully. This one matters more than you realize. Pearl looked down at it. Inside were transcripts, recorded conversations, screenshots, dates, patterns. The anatomy of emotional manipulation laid out clinically enough to make Pearl nauseous. You documented everything remarkably well once you started paying attention, Harper said. Pearl gave a faint, humorless smile. I think women notice everything. We just spend years convincing ourselves it's not important. Harper leaned back slightly. That sentence alone explains half my clients. The room fell quiet. Pearl opened the behavioral file slowly. There it was again. Cameron's voice from the balcony recording. She won't fight back. She never does. God. Every time she heard it, something inside her hardened further. Not hatred, clarity. Because that sentence revealed the core of their marriage more honestly than any vow ever had. Cameron loved predictability, and Pearl's kindness made her predictable. Until now. Harper slid another document toward her. Cameron's legal team officially responded this morning. Pearl scanned the first paragraph. Her stomach tightened immediately. Irreconcilable emotional incompatibility, mutual marital deterioration, emotional withdrawal by both parties. Pearl laughed softly in disbelief. Interesting, she murmured. Harper arched an eyebrow. What? He cheats on me for years and somehow we both become emotionally responsible. Harper's expression remained calm. Welcome to high net worth divorce strategy. Pearl continued reading. Then she saw it, one sentence buried carefully near the middle. Mrs. Holmes has experienced increasing emotional instability over the past year, creating communication difficulties within the marriage. Pearl went completely still. Not emotional instability. No. That wasn't accidental wording. That was groundwork. Harper. Her lawyer looked up immediately. They're building a psychological narrative. Harper nodded slowly. Yes. Cold anger moved through Pearl's chest, because suddenly Dana Mercer made terrifying sense. Discredit the woman emotionally first, then isolate her credibility. Cameron had done this before. How far can they push this? Pearl asked quietly. That depends on how aggressively he wants to fight. Pearl stared at the papers. For years, Cameron carefully curated her emotional reality inside the marriage. Now he was trying to curate public perception too. Except this time, she was awake. Harper folded her hands. There's more. Pearl looked up. We received notice this afternoon that Cameron's team may pursue a competency evaluation request if negotiations become hostile. The room seemed to sharpen around the edges. Pearl blinked once slowly. He wants to imply I'm mentally unstable? Not directly, Harper corrected. Strategically. Pearl stood abruptly from the table and walked toward the windows. Chicago stretched beneath the glass in silver and black reflections. Beautiful city. Cruel city. A city where powerful men destroyed women professionally every day while still receiving standing ovations at charity galas. I supported that man for 10 years, Pearl whispered. Harper said nothing. I defended him, protected him, built my entire life around his. Her voice cracked slightly for the first time in weeks. And now he's trying to turn me into a liability. Harper stood slowly behind her. Pearl. She turned. You need to understand something important right now. Pearl waited silently. The fact that Cameron is escalating this psychologically means he's scared. That stopped her. Scared, Harper nodded carefully. Confident men don't build emotional instability narratives unless they're trying to neutralize someone. Pearl inhaled slowly. Suddenly, the entire legal strategy looked different. This wasn't just reputation management anymore. It was defense, because Cameron finally realized she possessed enough information to damage him. Her phone buzzed against the table. Unknown number again. Pearl exchanged a glance with Harper before opening it. Unknown, he's preparing internal witnesses against you. Unknown. Start with Lydia Chen. Pearl frowned. Who's Lydia Chen? Harper immediately opened her laptop. Senior HR consultant for Reed Capital. Pearl's pulse slowed. Human resources. Of course. Can Cameron influence her? Harper's fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. She's worked under executive contract with Reed for 4 years. Meaning yes. Potentially very easily. Another realization struck Pearl hard. This entire system protected men like Cameron naturally. Corporate structures, board loyalties, PR teams, legal framing, everything designed to preserve stability around powerful executives. And women were expected to survive quietly. Pearl sat back down slowly. I won't let him rewrite me. Harper looked directly at her, then stopped defending his image emotionally. That landed deeper than Pearl expected. Because even now, some part of her still instinctively softened Cameron in her own mind. Still remembered the early years. Still wanted to believe there had once been genuine love beneath all this manipulation. But maybe that hope itself was part of the trap. Harper slid another file across the table. This is what we use if he escalates. Pearl opened it. Financial tracing, asset concealment evidence, Manhattan acquisition overlaps. Natalie Brooks's LLC payments. And suddenly Pearl understood the scale of destruction possible now. If this went public properly, Cameron's corporate image could collapse entirely. The realization made her feel sick. Not triumphant, just exhausted. "Do you want revenge?" Harper asked quietly. Pearl stared at the documents for a long moment, then answered honestly, "No." Harper seemed unsurprised. "I want the truth to stop bending around him." Silence filled the room afterward. Heavy. Human. Then Harper nodded once. "That's healthier than revenge." Pearl almost smiled faintly. Barely. Later that evening, Pearl returned to the penthouse earlier than expected. The apartment lights were dim except for Cameron's office. Voices drifted faintly through the hallway. Pearl slowed instinctively. Cameron wasn't alone. She moved closer quietly. Another male voice. Low. Nervous. "The board's asking questions now," Cameron answered sharply. "Then stabilize them. They're concerned about the financial overlap rumors." Silence. Then Cameron again, colder this time. "Pearl's becoming a problem. Problem. Not wife. Not partner. Problem." Pearl stood motionless outside the office door while her chest tightened painfully. No matter how much clarity she gained, some wounds still hurt fresh every time. Inside the office, the other man lowered his voice. "What if she talks?" Cameron laughed once. Short, controlled. "She won't." Pearl's pulse slowed instantly. Still underestimating her. "Even now, she's emotional," Cameron continued. "Eventually she'll want peace more than conflict." That sentence changed something inside Pearl permanently. Because suddenly she understood Cameron still believed her desire for emotional harmony outweighed her self-respect. That was his final miscalculation. The office door opened suddenly. Pearl stepped back smoothly into the hallway just as Cameron emerged. He froze immediately upon seeing her. For half a second, genuine uncertainty crossed his face. "How long have you been home?" Pearl met his gaze evenly. "Long enough." The same answer she gave him before. This time it landed differently. Because Cameron heard the warning underneath it now. The other executive slipped past awkwardly without meeting Pearl's eyes. Coward. Cameron closed the office door behind him carefully. "You've been listening to private conversations?" Pearl almost laughed. Interesting. Not denial. Not shame. Just outrage at losing informational control. "You spent years listening to my emotions only when they benefited you," she replied quietly. His jaw tightened. "That's not fair." Fair. The word felt absurd now. Pearl stepped closer slowly. "You know what's fascinating, Cameron?" He stayed silent. "You still think this is about preserving your comfort." Something dangerous flickered across his expression then. Not anger. Fear. Real fear. Because for the first time, he realized Pearl Holmes was no longer emotionally negotiating for the marriage. She was strategically preparing for war. And suddenly, Cameron Reed understood something horrifying. The woman he spent years managing emotionally had finally stopped needing his approval to become dangerous. The first leak appeared on a Thursday morning at 6:12 a.m. Not on television, not in a major newspaper, just a small financial blog followed obsessively by corporate analysts and investors who knew how to recognize smoke before fire. The headline was simple. Questions emerge over Reed Capital. Executive expense structures. No accusations. No affair mention. Just questions. That was the genius of it. Questions spread faster than allegations, because powerful people immediately start imagining worst-case answers. Pearl saw the article while sitting alone at the kitchen island, drinking coffee in silence. Across from her, Cameron's side of the marble counter remained untouched. He hadn't come home again. The old version of Pearl would have stayed awake, waiting. This version simply noticed the absence like weather. Her phone buzzed seconds later. "Harper." "Tell me you saw it," Harper said immediately. "I'm reading it now." Pearl scanned the article carefully. Luxury travel reimbursements. Unclear consulting transfers. Possible overlap between Reed Capital operational accounts and private acquisition structures. Nothing directly illegal. Yet. But enough to destabilize confidence. Pearl's pulse slowed slightly. "This didn't come from me," she said quietly. "I know." Which meant someone else had started moving pieces independently. Interesting. Dangerous too. Because uncontrolled leaks create panic. And panic makes powerful men reckless. "What's his response?" Pearl asked. "He called an emergency PR meeting at 5 this morning." Pearl almost smiled faintly. So Cameron was scared enough to wake up before dawn. Good. Not because she wanted him destroyed, because for the first time consequences had entered his reality. Harper continued carefully. "There's more." Pearl set her coffee down slowly. "Victor Hale resigned from 2 internal committees this morning." Pearl frowned. Why no official explanation? But unofficially pressure, distancing, preparation. The corporate ecosystem around Cameron Reed was shifting rapidly now, and everyone inside it could feel something breaking beneath the surface. Pearl walked toward the windows overlooking Lake Michigan, while gray morning light flooded the penthouse softly. 10 years. 10 years of loving a man whose entire world now looked structurally unstable. How much of it had always been illusion? Her phone buzzed again. This time from Savannah Mercer. "Savannah Pearl, please tell me you're not behind these rumors. Savannah Cameron says people are trying to destroy him professionally." Savannah. "This is getting ugly." Pearl stared at the messages for several seconds. "Interesting. Not, are you okay? Not, did he really betray you? Just concerned for Cameron's reputation." The old Pearl would have answered carefully. This Pearl simply locked the phone and placed it face down. An hour later, Cameron finally came home. The second he entered the penthouse, Pearl felt the difference in him immediately. Not emotional collapse. Cameron Reed would rather bleed privately than appear unstable publicly. But tension radiated from him now like static electricity. He loosened his tie sharply while walking toward the kitchen. "You saw the article." "Not a question?" Pearl remained seated calmly. "Yes." Cameron poured himself water with movements slightly too precise. That meant anger. Controlled anger was always the most dangerous version of him. "This isn't random," he said coldly. "No." His eyes snapped toward her immediately. Pearl met his gaze evenly over the rim of her coffee cup. "You think I leaked something?" "I think someone close to you did." There it was. Accusation wrapped carefully enough to remain deniable. Pearl almost admired the craftsmanship of his manipulation sometimes. Even now, Cameron framed suspicion like rational analysis instead of emotional intimidation. "I haven't spoken publicly about anything," Pearl replied. "That's not what I asked." The temperature in the room shifted instantly. For years, that tone alone would have destabilized her. Not anymore. Pearl stood slowly. "You don't get to interrogate me like an employee." Cameron's jaw tightened. "I'm trying to protect what's left of this situation." "No," Pearl corrected softly. "You're trying to protect perception." Silence. Sharp. Dangerous. Because she was right again. Cameron moved closer carefully. "You have no idea what's happening inside the company right now." Pearl tilted her head slightly. "Then tell me." Wrong answer. Because now, Cameron hesitated. And hesitation meant vulnerability. He looked away first. Tiny movement. But Pearl noticed. Always. Finally, he spoke again. "The board is nervous. About the affair, about instability. Of course. Always language designed to avoid moral accountability." Pearl crossed her arms slowly. "And are they nervous about the shell companies too?" Cameron froze. Actual stillness this time. Not subtle. Real. Pearl watched the calculation happening behind his eyes instantly. How much did she know? Who told her? What evidence existed? That reaction alone confirmed everything. "You've been going through private financial records," he said quietly. Pearl almost laughed. Interesting. Still no denial. You built another life using hidden money structures, she replied. His face hardened immediately. You don't understand corporate acquisitions. There it was again. Condescension. The assumption that financial complexity excused betrayal. Pearl stepped closer. No, she said softly. I understand them perfectly now. Something dangerous flickered across Cameron's expression then. Not just fear anymore, exposure. Because for the first time since the marriage began collapsing, he realized Pearl might actually comprehend the machinery underneath his empire. His phone buzzed suddenly. He checked it instantly. Then another message. And another. The color drained slightly from his face. Pearl noticed immediately. What happened? Cameron locked the screen too quickly. Nothing. Lie. Big one. Pearl could feel it instantly. Then Cameron grabbed his jacket again. I have to go. Where office? He was already moving toward the door. Running now. Not physically. Strategically. Because somewhere inside Reed Capital, something else had leaked. The second the front door closed behind him, Pearl's own phone rang. Victor Hale. She answered immediately. You should turn on CNBC, Victor said calmly. Pearl grabbed the remote instinctively. Financial news filled the screen. And there it was. A panel discussion. Reed Capital's stock sliding slightly beneath a red downward arrow. The anchor spoke carefully. Questions continue surrounding executive financial transparency at Reed Capital after anonymous documentation surfaced online this morning. Anonymous documentation. Another analyst jumped in. Nothing criminal has been confirmed. But investors hate uncertainty. Uncertainty. Corporate language for panic beginning. Pearl's heartbeat slowed strangely. Not satisfaction. Disbelief. Because this was real now. No longer private heartbreak hidden inside luxury apartments and quiet arguments. Now, Cameron's world was cracking publicly. Victor's voice returned through the phone. He's losing control of the narrative. Pearl stared at the television silently. Cameron appeared in archived interview footage, smiling confidently beside market projections and charity initiatives. The perfect executive, the visionary leader, the admired husband, all while secretly managing multiple realities underneath. Did you leak this? Pearl asked quietly. Victor chuckled once. If I wanted to destroy Cameron Reed publicly, you'd know. That answer chilled her slightly. Because she believed him. Then who someone inside his financial chain? Pearl thought immediately of Natalie Brooks. Or maybe someone even deeper. How bad is this? She asked. Victor went silent briefly before answering. Bad enough that Cameron's beginning to isolate internally. Pearl frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means powerful men start discovering how conditional loyalty really is. That sentence stayed with her long after the call ended. Conditional loyalty. God. Wasn't that exactly what her marriage had been too? Pearl walked slowly toward the balcony windows while financial analysts continued dissecting Cameron's company behind her. Outside Chicago glowed beneath cold afternoon rain. For years, Cameron Reed controlled every room he entered through certainty. But certainty was cracking now. And once cracks appear in powerful men, everyone starts searching for where the structure might finally break. Pearl's phone buzzed one last time that evening. Unknown number again. Unknown. He finally realizes someone inside his system is betraying him. Unknown now. Watch how dangerous Cameron becomes when he's afraid. Pearl stared at the message while a strange chill moved slowly through her chest. Because deep down she already knew it was true. The calm, manipulative version of Cameron Reed had been dangerous enough. But a frightened man losing power, that was an entirely different kind of threat. And somewhere beneath the unraveling corporate empire, the real war was only beginning. Tuesday morning arrived cold and gray over Chicago. The city looked metallic beneath low clouds, all sharp glass and wet pavement reflecting a world that suddenly felt transactional. Pearl Holmes stood inside Harper Lawson's office wearing a cream wool coat and black gloves, watching snow begin to fall lightly beyond the windows. Everything felt strangely quiet. Not externally. Externally, Cameron Reed's world was becoming chaos. Financial blogs continued dissecting Reed Capital's expense structures. Investors were demanding explanations. Board members were distancing themselves carefully enough to preserve deniability later. But inside Pearl's silence, the kind that comes after grief burns itself into clarity. Harper entered carrying coffee and a thin legal folder. He filed. Pearl turned slowly. Of course he did. Tuesday. Exactly like he threatened at the gala. Harper placed the folder on the conference table. His attorney submitted the petition at 8:42 a.m. Pearl removed her gloves carefully, and Harper smiled for the first time in weeks. A real smile. Not professional. Victorious. He's secondary. The words landed softly but powerfully. Secondary. Pearl sat down slowly while Harper opened the folder. Because your filing was accepted Monday morning at 9:14 a.m., jurisdictional priority belongs to you. Pearl stared down at the paperwork. After everything, after the humiliation, betrayal, manipulation, and public narrative management, Cameron Reed still lost the one thing he cared about most: control. He really thought he was ahead, Pearl murmured quietly. Harper nodded. Narcissistic personalities often mistake secrecy for superiority. Pearl almost laughed. God, that was Cameron exactly. He believed information automatically translated into power. But timing mattered too, and for once, Pearl moved first. Harper slid another page across the table. His filing requests aggressive asset protection review and temporary reputational confidentiality. Pearl raised an eyebrow slightly. Reputational confidentiality. He wants to limit public exposure regarding marital allegations. Interesting. So Cameron was afraid now. Not emotionally. Structurally. The office door opened quietly as Harper's assistant stepped inside, looking tense. Sorry to interrupt, she said carefully, but Reed Capital's legal counsel just arrived downstairs. Pearl's pulse slowed slightly. Already Harper exchanged a glance with her. That's fast. No. Not fast. Desperate. 10 minutes later, Cameron entered the conference room wearing a charcoal overcoat dusted lightly with snow. For a second, Pearl forgot how devastatingly composed he could still look. That was the dangerous thing about certain men. Their appearances survive long after truth collapses. But today, something underneath his composure had cracked. Pearl saw it instantly. The slight tension in his jaw. The exhaustion beneath his eyes. The controlled breathing of a man actively suppressing panic. Cameron's attorney entered behind him carrying multiple files. Professional, sharp, emotionless. Exactly the kind of woman Cameron would hire. Cameron looked directly at Pearl. No greeting, no softness, only calculation. You filed Monday, he said quietly. Not a question. Pearl folded her hands calmly. Yes. A long silence stretched across the conference room. Cameron's expression remained controlled, but she saw it now clearly: humiliation. Not because the marriage ended, because he lost positioning. You intentionally concealed the filing, his attorney said sharply. Harper immediately answered. My client acted within full legal rights. Cameron kept staring at Pearl. You knew I was preparing my filing. Pearl tilted her head slightly. You were preparing many things, Cameron. That landed hard. His jaw tightened immediately, because he knew exactly what she meant. The shell companies, Natalie Brooks, the hidden acquisitions, all of it. The room became still. Then Cameron sat down slowly across from her. For years, Pearl had watched this man dominate negotiations effortlessly. Boardrooms bent around his confidence naturally. Today, for the first time, he looked uncertain. His attorney opened a folder sharply. Mr. Reed intends to pursue an efficient dissolution process without unnecessary escalation. Pearl almost smiled. Efficient. Another sanitized word. Everything with Cameron became emotionally sterile once accountability entered the room. Harper leaned back calmly. That depends entirely on transparency. Cameron's eyes flicked immediately toward Pearl. Searching. Measuring. trying to determine how much she truly knew. Pearl held his gaze steadily, and suddenly she remembered something strange. The first apartment they shared together in Boston. Tiny kitchen. Cheap furniture. Cameron kissing flour off her cheek while they ruined homemade pasta together. Back then he laughed easier, touched her constantly, looked at her like love instead of infrastructure. The memory hurt unexpectedly, because some part of her still grieved the possibility that maybe he had once been real. Cameron interrupted her thoughts quietly. "What do you want, Pearl?" The question startled everyone slightly, because it sounded genuine, not strategic. For one brief second, genuine exhaustion entered his voice. Pearl studied him carefully. What did she want? Not revenge, not destruction, not even reconciliation anymore. She wanted reality to stop bending around his comfort. "I want honesty," she answered softly. Cameron laughed once, tired, disbelieving. "You think this is about honesty?" "No," Pearl replied. "I think everything collapsed because it wasn't." Silence, heavy enough to bruise. Cameron looked away first. Again. That mattered more than anyone else in the room realized. His attorney shifted the conversation quickly. "We should discuss asset division." "Of course. Back to structure. Back to numbers." Because emotional truth was dangerous territory now. Harper opened another file slowly. "We're prepared to discuss hidden acquisition overlaps first." Everything stopped. Completely. Cameron went still beside his attorney. Not subtle tension this time. Actual stillness. His attorney frowned immediately. "I'm sorry," Pearl watched Cameron carefully. There it was. Fear. Real fear. Harper continued calmly. "Specifically Manhattan shell structures connected to Natalie Brooks Consulting, LLC." The silence afterward felt explosive. Cameron's attorney slowly turned toward him. "What is she referring to?" Interesting. He hadn't told his own legal team everything. Massive mistake. Cameron answered too quickly. "It's irrelevant." "No," Pearl said softly. "It really isn't." His eyes snapped toward her instantly. The old version of Pearl would have backed down under that stare. This version remained perfectly still. Cameron leaned forward slowly. "What exactly are you trying to do?" Pearl met his gaze. And finally, she said the truth out loud. "I'm trying to understand how long you planned my replacement before informing me." That hit harder than financial threats ever could. Because for the first time since entering the room, Cameron looked human instead of powerful. Tired. Cornered. Almost sad. But then it disappeared again beneath calculation. "You think Natalie mattered more than she did?" Pearl stared at him in disbelief. God. Even now, he was minimizing emotional destruction instead of confronting it. "No," she replied quietly. "I think your inability to tell the truth mattered more than you realize." Harper's assistant entered suddenly again, visibly nervous. "Sorry," she whispered urgently to Harper. "The court clerk just sent confirmation." Harper read the email quickly, then looked directly at Cameron. "Your filing has officially been categorized as secondary jurisdiction." The room went silent again. Final this time. Cameron closed his eyes briefly, just once. But Pearl saw it, and suddenly she understood something heartbreaking. Men like Cameron never imagine losing until the exact second control disappears from their hands. For years, Cameron Reed believed he was directing every emotional outcome around him. The marriage, the affair, the divorce, the corporate optics, all carefully managed. But now a court clerk in downtown Chicago had reduced his carefully engineered strategy into one devastating word: secondary. Pearl stood slowly from the table. Cameron looked up immediately. Their eyes met across years of love manipulation, grief, intimacy, betrayal, and unfinished anger. Then Pearl spoke softly. "You should have filed Monday." And for the first time since the gala, Cameron Reed looked completely defeated. Not publicly, not legally, personally, because he finally understood the one thing he never anticipated: Pearl Holmes had stopped waiting for him to decide her future. She already had. After Tuesday, everything changed. Not dramatically at first. No screaming headlines. No instant collapse. Power rarely disappears all at once in wealthy corporate worlds. It erodes quietly. One conversation at a time. One withheld phone call. One board member stepping back half an inch emotionally. And Cameron Reed felt every second of it. By Friday morning, Reed Capital's stock had stabilized publicly. But internally, panic moved beneath the surface like an electrical current nobody wanted to acknowledge aloud. Pearl saw it in the way Cameron stopped sleeping properly. He started pacing during late-night calls, stopped finishing meals, snapped at assistants over minor scheduling errors. His perfection was beginning to fracture at the edges, and manipulative men become dangerous when their image starts slipping faster than their control can recover. Pearl stood inside the penthouse kitchen pouring tea when Cameron entered wearing a navy suit and exhaustion beneath his eyes. For a second, he simply watched her. That happened more now. Watching. Like he was trying to understand how the woman he once emotionally managed so easily became impossible to predict. "You're home early," Pearl said calmly. "Board meeting got moved." Lie. Small one, but still a lie. Pearl noticed something else, too. He wasn't carrying his phone. Cameron never separated from his phone voluntarily. Interesting. He walked toward the bar cart and poured whiskey at 11 in the morning. Also new. "Rough week?" Pearl asked softly. He laughed once under his breath. "You enjoying this?" Pearl looked at him carefully. There it was again. The assumption that if she wasn't devastated, she must be cruel. "No," she answered honestly. "I think watching someone unravel is sad." That answer hit him harder than anger would have. Because sadness implied disappointment. And disappointment is harder to manipulate than rage. Cameron drank half the whiskey in one swallow. People are turning this into something bigger than it is. Pearl almost smiled faintly. Affairs usually feel smaller to the person having them. His jaw tightened instantly. It wasn't just an affair. The sentence slipped out before he could stop it. Silence followed immediately. Pearl's pulse slowed. Interesting. For weeks he minimized Natalie constantly. Now suddenly not just an affair. Pearl set her tea down carefully. What was it then? Cameron looked away toward the windows. Chicago stretched beyond the glass in cold silver winter light. "I don't know anymore." And for one brief, dangerous moment he sounded honest. Not strategic, not polished, just tired. Pearl hated how much that still hurt. Because even after everything, some part of her still responded instinctively when Cameron sounded emotionally real. That was the final cruelty of long relationships. Your body remembers tenderness even after your mind understands betrayal. Her phone buzzed before she could answer. "Harper." Pearl stepped into the hallway to take the call. "We have movement," Harper said immediately. What kind of movement? Cameron's financial counsel requested emergency mediation discussions. Pearl blinked slowly. Emergency? That meant pressure. Real pressure. He wants settlement now. He wants containment. Containment. Of course. Harper lowered her voice slightly. "We also confirmed the Manhattan acquisition overlap." Pearl's heartbeat slowed. How bad? Bad enough that if Discovery expands publicly, Reed Capital could face regulatory review. Jesus. Pearl leaned against the hallway wall slowly. She never wanted this. Not truly. She wanted truth. Closure. Dignity. Not corporate destruction. But Cameron built his empire too close to his lies. Now everything was bleeding together. "There's more," Harper added carefully. "Tell me." Natalie Brooks retained independent legal counsel yesterday. Pearl closed her eyes briefly. Of course she did. Because Natalie finally realized something: two men who manipulate wives usually manipulate mistresses eventually. Pearl returned to the kitchen afterward. Cameron stood staring out at the skyline with one hand pressed against the counter. He looked older suddenly. Not physically, energetically. Like the effort of maintaining control was exhausting him from the inside. "Harper?" he asked without turning around. "Yes. What now?" Interesting question. Not aggressive. Almost resigned. Pearl moved beside him slowly. She says your financial overlap problem is getting harder to contain. That landed immediately. Cameron closed his eyes once. Tiny reaction, but real. You gave her everything. No, Pearl corrected softly. You left everything where I could finally see it. Silence. Then Cameron laughed bitterly under his breath. You know what the worst part is? Pearl looked at him carefully. You were never supposed to understand this world. There it was. The truth beneath everything. Not just emotional manipulation. Intellectual dismissal. He spent years convincing himself Pearl existed outside complexity, outside power, outside strategy. And now she understood enough to threaten him. Pearl folded her arms slowly. You spent 10 years mistaking emotional intelligence for weakness. His eyes finally met hers again. And for the first time, Cameron looked ashamed. Real shame. Not reputation panic. Not strategic regret. Human shame. I loved you, he said quietly. The words hit her chest like broken glass. Because maybe he believed them. That was the tragedy. People like Cameron often confuse possession with love until everything collapses. Pearl swallowed carefully. You loved being needed, she replied softly. That destroyed him more than yelling ever could. His expression cracked visibly, because deep down he knew she was right. The penthouse fell silent afterward except for distant traffic below. Then Cameron asked something unexpected. Did you ever hate me? Pearl stared at him for a long moment. The answer should have been yes. After everything, it should have been easy. But hate requires emotional attachment too, and Pearl was becoming something else now. No, she answered honestly. What then? She looked toward the lake beyond the windows. Grief. His face tightened painfully. Because grief sounds permanent. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Pearl opened the message slowly. Unknown, Natalie Brooks requested immunity protections this morning. Unknown Cameron doesn't know yet. Pearl's pulse slowed instantly. Immunity protections. That meant Natalie was preparing to cooperate if legal exposure expanded, which meant Cameron's inner circle was collapsing rapidly now. Pearl looked back at him standing beside the windows. Still beautiful, still powerful, still dangerous, but suddenly vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. The illusion surrounding Cameron Reed was finally breaking from multiple directions at once. Corporate pressure, legal exposure, internal betrayal, and perhaps worst of all, the loss of Pearl's emotional loyalty. Because for years, that loyalty stabilized him more than he realized. Cameron stepped closer suddenly. Pearl. Something fragile entered his voice. She looked up. If this gets worse, he stopped, unable to finish. Interesting. The man who controlled every room suddenly couldn't complete sentences. Pearl waited silently. Finally, he whispered, They'll destroy me. The honesty of it stunned her. Not this will hurt the company. Not the board will overreact. Just, they'll destroy me. And for the first time since the gala, Pearl truly saw him. Not the executive, not the manipulator, not the husband, just a frightened man standing inside consequences he spent years believing would never reach him. The problem was Pearl no longer knew whether she wanted to save him. That realization hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself. Because once upon a time, she would have burned down her own dignity to protect Cameron Reed. Now she simply looked at him quietly and said, You should have thought about that before you made me disposable. He flinched, actual physical pain crossing his face. And in that moment, Cameron finally understood the true shift in power between them. Pearl Holmes no longer needed his love badly enough to abandon herself for it. Which meant for the first time in their entire marriage, he had absolutely no control left. The collapse started publicly on a Monday. By noon, 3 financial outlets had picked up the Reed Capital story. Not the affair. Not yet. Still the money. That was how powerful men usually fell in America, not because they hurt people emotionally, but because instability threatens investors. Pearl sat in silence inside Harper Lawson's office while CNBC played muted across the wall-mounted television. Cameron's face appeared on screen beside the headline, Reed Capital Board Requests Internal Review. The image hurt unexpectedly. Not because Pearl wanted to protect him anymore, but because once upon a time she had loved that face without hesitation. Harper handed her another stack of documents. Victor Hale officially resigned this morning. Pearl looked up immediately. He released a statement citing ethical concerns regarding leadership transparency. Jesus! Victor moving publicly meant the internal fracture was becoming irreversible. Pearl rubbed slowly at her temple. Everything felt too large now. The marriage had exploded outward into something neither she nor Cameron fully controlled anymore. Harper studied her carefully. "You okay?" Pearl laughed softly. What a strange question. Was she okay? Her husband cheated on her, manipulated her emotionally for years, built hidden financial systems around another woman, attempted to position her as unstable in court, and now his corporate empire was beginning to bleed publicly. No, she wasn't okay. But she was awake, and that mattered more. Her phone buzzed. Natalie Brooks. Pearl stared at the screen in disbelief. Interesting. Very interesting. She answered slowly. Hello? Natalie sounded exhausted. Not seductive, not confident. Just tired. I think we need to talk. Pearl leaned back in her chair. Why? A long silence followed. Then Natalie whispered, because Cameron lied to both of us. That sentence landed like cold water. Pearl closed her eyes briefly. Of course he did. The real tragedy wasn't that Cameron betrayed two women. It was that he made both of them believe they were exceptions while emotionally managing them differently. When Pearl asked quietly, When did you realize? Natalie laughed bitterly through the phone. This weekend. Pearl stayed silent. Natalie inhaled shakily. He told me the Manhattan properties were temporary acquisitions. Pearl's pulse slowed. They weren't, no. Fear entered Natalie's voice now. Real fear. He put assets under structures connected to my company without fully explaining legal exposure. There it was. Cameron blending emotional relationships into operational systems again. Natalie continued quietly. I thought he loved me. The honesty hurt more than Pearl expected, because for one terrible moment she heard herself in that sentence too. The same confusion, the same grief, the same humiliation of realizing love had been tangled together with strategy. Pearl stared out Harper's office windows at the snowy Chicago skyline. What do you want from me? She asked softly. I don't know anymore. Another long silence. Then Natalie whispered something that changed everything. He's starting to scare me. Pearl went still instantly. Not physically violent. Cameron was too controlled for that. But emotionally, strategically, men losing power become unpredictable. What happened? Pearl asked carefully. He came to my apartment Saturday night. Natalie's breathing trembled slightly now. He kept asking who leaked information. He went through my phone. He accused me of setting him up. Harper looked up sharply from across the desk, immediately sensing the shift in Pearl's expression. Natalie kept talking. I've never seen him like that before. Pearl closed her eyes briefly. Yes, you have, she thought. You just didn't recognize it when it was directed subtly. Because Cameron's cruelty rarely looked explosive initially. It looked controlled, precise, emotionally suffocating. What did you tell him? Pearl asked. The truth. And Natalie laughed weakly. He doesn't believe truth anymore. That sentence stayed inside Pearl's chest painfully. Because maybe Cameron spent so many years manipulating narratives that he eventually stopped trusting reality itself. Harper mouthed silently, speakerphone. Pearl nodded slightly and activated it. Natalie continued. He said everyone's betraying him now. Harper immediately interjected calmly. Natalie, this is Harper Lawson. Silence exploded through the phone. Oh my God. You may want independent legal protection immediately, Harper continued professionally. Natalie's breathing quickened. So it's really that serious? Harper and Pearl exchanged a glance. Neither answered immediately. Because yes, it was. After the call ended, Harper leaned back slowly. She's terrified. Pearl folded her arms tightly across her chest. I almost feel sorry for her. Harper nodded once. That means you're healing. Pearl frowned slightly. No. It means I know what emotional manipulation feels like now. That afternoon, Cameron called 6 times. Pearl answered none. By evening, he came home. The second he entered the penthouse, Pearl felt the energy immediately. Not polished anymore. Fractured. He looked exhausted in a way expensive suits couldn't hide. His tie hung loose, his movements too sharp, too fast, like his thoughts were outrunning his composure. You spoke to Natalie. Not a question. Pearl remained seated on the couch. Yes. Cameron laughed once. The sound held no warmth at all. Unbelievable. Pearl studied him carefully. This was new. Not the controlled executive, not the emotionally detached husband. This version looked cornered. And cornered men tell the truth accidentally. She's scared of you, Pearl said quietly. That hit instantly. His face hardened. I never touched her. Interesting. Straight to physical denial. Pearl almost smiled sadly. That's not what I meant. Silence. Heavy. Then Cameron began pacing slowly across the penthouse. They're all turning on me. There it was again. Not accountability. Betrayal. Because people like Cameron always experience consequences as unfair abandonment. The board, he continued bitterly. Victor. Natalie. Even you. Pearl stood slowly. Even me. He looked at her sharply. Yes. The audacity of it almost stole her breath. After everything, he still viewed her refusal to protect him as betrayal. You destroyed our marriage, Pearl whispered. No, Cameron snapped suddenly. You abandoned me emotionally years ago. The room went completely still. Because finally, the mask slipped. Not fully, but enough. Pearl stared at him in disbelief. You cheated on me. You stopped seeing me. His voice echoed violently through the penthouse. And there it was, the emotional core underneath all of it. Not love. Entitlement. Cameron moved closer, breathing harder now. You know what it's like being surrounded by people constantly needing things from you? Pearl's chest tightened painfully. Because once upon a time, she would have comforted him through this. Once upon a time, she would have absorbed his emotional chaos to stabilize him again. But now she saw the pattern clearly. Cameron only became emotionally expressive once control disappeared. You made me lonely inside my own marriage, Pearl said softly. For a second, actual pain crossed his face. Then immediately, defensiveness again. You think you were easy to love. The sentence hit like a slap. Silence flooded the room afterward. Immediate. Horrified. Even Cameron looked stunned he said it aloud. Pearl felt something inside her finally break completely. Not heartbreak. The last illusion. Because deep down she always feared this truth, that Cameron viewed loving her as labor instead of privilege. Tears filled her eyes instantly. Not weakness. Grief. Pure grief for the woman she used to be. The woman who spent years trying harder for a man who measured her emotional worth through convenience. Cameron saw the tears and immediately regretted it. I didn't mean... Yes, Pearl interrupted quietly. You did. He stepped toward her desperately now. Pearl, no. Her voice stopped him instantly. Calm, final. For the first time in their marriage, Cameron Reed looked genuinely powerless. Not financially, not legally, emotionally. Because Pearl Holmes finally understood something devastating. The cruelest people are often not the ones who never loved you. They're the ones who loved you only as long as loving you remained easy for them. Pearl wiped her tears slowly. then looked directly at the man she once would have destroyed herself to keep, and softly said, "I think this is the first honest conversation we've ever had." Cameron's face collapsed completely. Not publicly, not strategically, humanly. And standing there inside the ruins of the life they built together, Pearl realized something unexpected. She no longer wanted Cameron Reed to love her correctly. She just wanted him out of her soul. The final settlement meeting took place on a Wednesday afternoon in early December. Snow drifted softly outside the high-rise law offices, while Chicago disappeared beneath white haze and winter silence. Inside Conference Room B, everything felt painfully sharp. Glass table, leather chairs, stacks of legal documents, 10 years of marriage reduced to paperwork and signatures. Pearl Holmes arrived first, not because she was nervous, because she wanted a few quiet minutes alone before officially ending the life she once thought would last forever. She stood beside the windows overlooking the frozen lake, hands folded calmly in front of her cream-colored coat. For the first time in months, she felt peaceful. Not happy. Peaceful. There was a difference. Pain still existed inside her, but it no longer controlled the atmosphere around her life. Harper Lawson entered carrying the finalized settlement folders. "You ready?" Pearl exhaled slowly. "No." Then she smiled faintly. "But I'm done postponing reality." Harper nodded once. "That's enough." 10 minutes later, Cameron arrived. Alone. No PR advisor, no extra legal consultants. Just him and his attorney. The moment Pearl saw him, grief moved unexpectedly through her chest again. Not because she wanted him back, because endings are painful even when necessary. Cameron looked thinner now. The kind of thinness stress creates quietly. His public image had survived but damaged. Reed Capital's board stripped several oversight authorities from him temporarily. Victor Hale's resignation triggered additional investigations. Natalie Brooks disappeared completely from public view after securing legal representation. And Cameron, he looked like a man who finally understood consequences don't disappear just because you explain them elegantly. Their eyes met across the room. For a second, nobody spoke. 10 years sat silently between them. Christmas mornings, hospital visits, shared apartments, private jokes, loneliness, manipulation, affection, betrayal, all of it. Cameron sat down slowly across from her. Harper immediately began discussing settlement structures professionally, but Pearl barely heard the first several minutes, because she was watching Cameron instead, watching the exhaustion in him, watching the way he avoided looking directly at her too long now. Interesting. Once upon a time, Cameron Reed could hold eye contact with anyone effortlessly. Now even Pearl's silence unsettled him. The attorneys discussed asset division, properties, trusts, investment separation. Everything clinical, everything emotionally sterile. Then Harper slid the final disclosure packet across the table. "This resolves all known financial overlap concerns, contingent upon compliance." Cameron's attorney reviewed it carefully. Cameron barely looked. He kept watching Pearl instead. Finally, he spoke quietly. "Can we have a minute alone?" Harper looked toward Pearl immediately. Her choice. Pearl hesitated, then nodded once. The attorneys exited silently, leaving the room painfully quiet. Snow continued falling outside. Soft, endless. Cameron leaned back slowly in his chair. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then he laughed softly under his breath. "I really thought you'd never leave me." The honesty startled her, not because it was romantic, because it was devastatingly true. Pearl looked down at her wedding ring resting beside the documents. She stopped wearing it weeks ago, but she still carried it sometimes without understanding why. "You made leaving feel impossible," she replied quietly. Cameron rubbed tiredly at his face. "I know." That almost hurt more than denial would have. Because finally he saw it too. The emotional dependency, the slow shrinking, the manipulation disguised as partnership. I didn't understand what I was doing for a long time, he admitted softly. Pearl looked at him carefully. You understood enough to hide it. Silence. That landed. Cameron stared toward the snowy windows. I kept thinking if I controlled everything carefully enough. He stopped. What I could avoid becoming my father. Pearl frowned slightly. Interesting. Cameron almost never spoke about his childhood. In 10 years of marriage, she could count those conversations on one hand. My mother worshipped him, Cameron continued quietly, and he still cheated constantly. Pearl stayed silent. He destroyed her confidence so slowly she didn't even notice it happening. The room felt colder suddenly, because now Pearl saw it. The inheritance. Not excuse. Pattern. Cameron laughed bitterly. I spent years swearing I'd never become him. Pearl's chest tightened painfully. And then, he looked directly at her. I learned how power works. That sentence carried horrifying honesty. Not justification, recognition. Pearl stared at the man she once trusted with her entire emotional life. You know the saddest part, she whispered. Cameron waited silently. I would have stayed through almost anything if you had just respected me enough to tell the truth. His face collapsed slightly at that, because he knew it was true. Pearl was loyal to the point of self-destruction once. Cameron leaned forward slowly. I did love you. The words no longer shattered her. That surprised her most. Instead, they just felt heavy, complicated, incomplete. You loved me when I was emotionally useful, Pearl replied softly. No. Yes. He looked away again, because deep down he knew she was right. Pearl reached slowly for the settlement documents. I kept trying to become easier to love, she admitted quietly. Cameron closed his eyes briefly. Pearl, but healthy love doesn't require someone to disappear. Silence filled the room again, this time softer, sad instead of sharp. Cameron looked older now than when this started. Not weaker, just human. And maybe that was the cruel irony of everything it took losing control for him to become emotionally honest. Too late. Always too late. He looked at the ring beside her hand. You keeping it, Pearl picked it up slowly between her fingers. For years, this tiny piece of gold represented identity. Marriage, security, belonging. Now it just felt like memory. No, she answered. Then she slid it gently across the table toward him. Cameron stared at it like it physically hurt to see. Good. Not from cruelty, from truth. Because objects sometimes become unbearable once they stop supporting illusions. You know, he said quietly, part of me thought you'd eventually forgive me. Pearl almost smiled sadly. I did forgive you. He looked up sharply. What I forgave you weeks ago. Confusion crossed his face immediately. Then why are we here? Pearl's voice stayed calm. Because forgiveness and access are not the same thing. That sentence changed something in him. She saw it instantly. For years, Cameron believed love guaranteed permanent emotional access. Now he finally understood people can forgive you completely and still choose never to let you hurt them again. Pearl opened the final folder slowly. Inside rested the completed settlement agreement. Everything finalized, everything over. Her chest tightened unexpectedly. Because grief still existed. Not for the marriage itself anymore, for the woman she used to be inside it. Pearl signed first. The sound of the pen against paper felt strangely loud. Final. She slid the documents across the table toward Cameron. He stared down at them silently for several seconds, then looked back at her, and for the first time since the gala, there was no manipulation left in his face. No strategy, no control, just loss. Real loss. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, he whispered. Tears filled Pearl's eyes instantly, because maybe he finally meant it honestly, and maybe that was the tragedy. Not that Cameron never loved her, but that he only fully recognized her value after destroying the relationship that held it. Pearl stood slowly gathering her coat. Then she looked at him one final time. Not with hatred, not with longing, Just truth. You should have loved me while I was still willing to stay. Cameron lowered his eyes, unable to answer. And Pearl Holmes walked out of the conference room without looking back. Because sometimes healing doesn't sound dramatic. Sometimes it sounds like expensive heels disappearing quietly down a hallway, while the woman wearing them finally chooses herself completely. 6 months later, Pearl Holmes no longer flinched when people said Cameron Reed's name. That was how she knew she was healing. Not because the memories disappeared. They didn't. Healing was stranger than that. It was remembering everything clearly, without needing it to hurt forever. Spring arrived slowly in Chicago that year. The snow melted from sidewalks. Trees regained color. The city softened around the edges again after months of gray winter exhaustion. And for the first time in years, Pearl felt like her life belonged to her. Not to a marriage, not to a performance, not to someone else's emotional gravity. To her. She moved out of the penthouse 3 months after the settlement finalized. Not because she couldn't legally keep it, because she no longer wanted spaces filled with emotional ghosts. Now she lived in a restored brownstone near the lake, smaller, warmer, quieter. Sunlight reached every room in the morning. There were books stacked carelessly beside windows. Fresh flowers in the kitchen. The place looked lived in, loved in. Her therapist once told her, safety and luxury are not always the same thing. Pearl finally understood that now. On Saturday morning, she walked to a small cafe nearby where nobody treated her like a scandal headline or a corporate wife. The barista knew her order. The owner's dog slept beside the register. Sometimes Pearl sat for hours sketching interior concepts again, something she abandoned years ago while becoming Cameron's emotional infrastructure. Now she was rebuilding herself professionally too. Slowly, carefully, honestly. Her design consulting work started quietly through referrals, then expanded faster than she expected. Turns out, intelligence returns quickly once it's no longer trapped inside survival mode. Pearl smiled more now. Real smiles. Not strategic ones. Not graceful wife smiles designed to keep rooms comfortable. Actual happiness occasionally surprised her in small moments. Sunlight through kitchen windows. Fresh coffee. Silence that no longer felt lonely. That was the thing nobody tells you about toxic love. Peace feels unfamiliar at first. Her phone buzzed while she reviewed fabric samples at her dining table. Savannah Mercer. Pearl answered calmly. You free tonight? For what dinner? And before you say no, I'm not trying to talk about Cameron. Pearl laughed softly. Okay, maybe a little about Cameron. Pearl hesitated, then smiled faintly. Fine. That night she met Savannah at a quiet rooftop restaurant downtown overlooking the river. Chicago glittered beneath warm spring rain while jazz played softly overhead. Savannah studied Pearl carefully across the table. You look different. Pearl raised an eyebrow. Older, no. Savannah smiled sadly. Lighter. That word stayed with Pearl. Lighter. Yes. Not because life became easy, because she stopped carrying someone else's emotional chaos as her responsibility. Savannah stirred her wine slowly. I owe you an apology. Pearl stayed quiet. I defended Cameron for way too long. There it was. Not surprising anymore. Most people defend charismatic men until consequences become impossible to ignore. Savannah looked down. I think we all did. Pearl exhaled softly. You know the worst part? Savannah looked up. I spent years trying to explain my loneliness in ways people would believe. Her friend's face tightened painfully, and nobody listened. No, Pearl replied gently. They listened. They just trusted his version more. Silence settled between them. Then Savannah spoke quietly. He resigned last week. Pearl froze slightly. What officially temporary strategic leave, meaning forced removal. Pearl stared toward the skyline beyond the rooftop glass. Strange. The news should have felt bigger emotionally. Instead, it just felt finished. Savannah hesitated before adding, he asked about you. Of course he did. Pearl looked back down at her wine. And he said, "Losing you ruined him." The sentence hurt unexpectedly. Not enough to reopen wounds, just enough to remind her that grief and love can coexist long after relationships die. Pearl smiled sadly. "No," she said quietly. "Losing himself ruined him." Savannah looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, because deep down, everyone understood it now. Cameron Reed didn't destroy his life because he fell in love with another woman. He destroyed it because he believed control mattered more than honesty. And eventually, people who manipulate love stop recognizing real intimacy when it's standing directly in front of them. 3 weeks later, Pearl saw Cameron one final time. Completely by accident. She was leaving a bookstore downtown carrying coffee and 2 architecture magazines when she noticed him across the street. For a second, neither moved. Traffic blurred noisily between them while spring wind lifted loose strands of Pearl's hair. Cameron looked different. Not ruined, not broken, just quieter, less certain. He crossed the street slowly toward her. Pearl's heartbeat stayed calm. That surprised her most, because there was a time hearing his footsteps behind her could emotionally destabilize her entire day. Now nothing collapsed inside her. "Hi," he said softly. "Hi." A small, awkward silence followed. No lawyers, no boardrooms, no manipulation. Just 2 people standing inside the remains of a life they once built together. Cameron glanced toward the magazines in her arms. "You're designing again." Pearl smiled faintly. "Yes, you're good at it." The compliment almost made her emotional. Not because she needed it anymore, because years ago she desperately did. Cameron shoved his hands into his coat pocket slowly. "I read about your Michigan project." Pearl blinked slightly. "You follow my work," a sad smile crossed his face. "I follow you." That hurt. Not romantically, humanly. Because once upon a time, that sentence would have meant everything to her. Now it arrived too late. Always too late. Cameron looked exhausted beneath the spring sunlight. Not professionally. Spiritually. "I was awful to you," he admitted quietly. Pearl studied him carefully. This version of Cameron felt unfamiliar. No performance. No emotional steering. Just honesty stripped bare by consequence. "Yes," she answered softly. He nodded once, accepting it. No defense this time. The silence between them felt strangely peaceful. Then Cameron asked, "Do you think we could have survived if I told the truth earlier?" Pearl thought about it honestly. The affair, the manipulation, the loneliness, the years she spent shrinking herself. Then she answered with complete truth. "No." He looked surprised. Pearl smiled sadly, because by the time people start lying that much, the relationship usually died long before the confession. Cameron lowered his eyes. She continued gently, "But maybe we could have hurt each other less." That one broke him quietly. Pearl saw it happen in real time. Not dramatic, just the subtle collapse of a man finally understanding the full weight of what he destroyed. A taxi honked nearby. Life kept moving around them. Pearl adjusted the magazines in her arms. "I should go." Cameron nodded slowly. Then suddenly, "I did love you, Pearl." She believed him now. That was the tragedy. Not all love is healthy. Not all love is safe. Not all love knows how to stop being selfish. Pearl stepped back slightly. "I know." Tears filled his eyes immediately. Not enough to fall. Just enough to shine. And for the first time in their entire relationship, Pearl didn't feel responsible for comforting him. That was freedom. Real freedom. She gave him one final soft smile, then turned and walked away into the bright Chicago afternoon without looking back. Not because she hated him, because she finally loved herself enough not to return to what broke her. And behind her, Cameron Reed remained standing alone on the sidewalk, watching the woman he underestimated become someone he could never reach again. Some people think heartbreak happens the moment betrayal is discovered. But often the real heartbreak begins much earlier when someone slowly teaches you that your needs are too much, your feelings are inconvenient, and your love should survive on crumbs. Pearl's story was never just about cheating or divorce. It was about a woman waking up after years of abandoning herself in the name of loyalty. One of the hardest lessons in life is realizing that love alone cannot save a relationship where respect no longer exists. You can be patient, forgiving, understanding, and endlessly supportive, and still be treated like you are easy to lose. That is why self-worth matters more than attachment. Because the moment you start shrinking yourself to keep someone comfortable, you begin disappearing from your own life. But healing changes everything. Healing is not revenge. It is not making the other person suffer the way you suffered. Real healing is reaching a point where their choices no longer define your value. It is waking up one morning and realizing you no longer need closure from the person who broke you. It is understanding that peace feels better than begging for love. And sometimes the strongest thing a woman can do is quietly walk away from the table where she was never truly appreciated. Cameron lost Pearl long before the divorce papers were signed. He lost her the moment he stopped treating her heart with care. And like many people who take loyalty for granted, he only understood her value after she learned to live without him. If this story touched you in any way, let me know in the comments. What do you think hurts more, being betrayed, or realizing how long you ignored the signs? And if you believe stories about healing self-worth, emotional strength, and powerful life lessons deserve more space in this world, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us for the next journey.